In 16th century Europe, bedtime wasn't peaceful, it was terrifying. Tonight, we slip beneath scratchy sheets and flickering candlelight to uncover the bizarre and bone-chilling beliefs people held about the night, from demons lurking at the foot of the bed to souls slipping away in sleep. Every creak in the dark was a reason to pray. You didn't just rest, you hoped to wake up. If soft-spoken stories of superstition and survival calm your modern mind, you're right where you need to be. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon to keep exploring the eerie, the ancient, and the quietly unsettling side of history, one sleepy tale at a time. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening
From, and what time is it for you right now?
It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. As you settle beneath your modern covers tonight, soft pillows supporting your head, and ambient sounds perhaps filtering through your bedroom, it might be difficult to imagine the terror that accompanied bedtime for many in 16th century England. The comfort you feel as you drift into slumber would have been a luxury few could afford in Tudor times, both materially and psychologically. For in those days, the approach of night brought with it not just darkness, but the very real fear of supernatural visitation. In the rural homes of 16th century England, as evening shadows lengthened and candles burned low, anxiety would rise. Families would gather, voices lowering as daylight faded to ensure all protective rituals were properly observed before sleep. While we modern folk might scoff at such superstitions, for the Tudor-era sleeper these practices were deadly serious matters of spiritual and physical survival. After all, night was when the boundaries between our world and the supernatural realm grew thin, permitting all manner of malevolent entities to cross over. Chief among these nocturnal terrors was the creature known variously as the night hag, old hag, or in more scholarly circles, the mare, from which our modern word nightmare derives. This was no mere bad dream to the 16th century mind. The night hag was a real, physical entity that attacked sleepers in their beds, sitting upon their chests, crushing the breath from their lungs, and sometimes, it was believed, stealing their very souls. William White, a clerk from Northumberland whose diary entries from 1578 have survived, described his experience. "Last night, as I lay in slumber, I felt a most dreadful weight descend upon my breast as if some great beast had placed itself there. I could not move limb nor tongue, though my mind was alert to the horror. Above me loomed a fearsome hag, her ancient face twisted in malice as she pressed down, stealing my breath and filling me with a terror beyond description. Only when I managed to whisper the Lord's name did she vanish, leaving me bathed in sweat and afraid to return to sleep." This account, typical of the period, describes what we now recognize as sleep paralysis, a phenomenon where a person, upon falling asleep or waking, temporarily experiences an inability to move or speak while fully conscious. Often accompanied by hallucinations and a sensation of pressure on the chest, the experience can be terrifying even today. But lacking our scientific understanding, Tudor folk interpreted these episodes through the lens of their supernatural worldview. The belief in the night hag crossed social boundaries, afflicting peasant and aristocrat alike. Even King Henry VIII reportedly experienced such visitations, leading to periods of extreme insomnia that court physicians struggled to remedy. His personal chaplain prescribed elaborate bedtime prayers and the placement of sacred objects around the royal bedchamber, including a silver cross positioned at the foot of the bed to repel the hag. Sleep chambers themselves were structured with supernatural protection in mind. Beds were often positioned against walls rather than in the center of rooms, reducing the angles from which a night hag might approach. Curtained beds offered both practical warmth and symbolic protection, creating a sanctified space the malevolent entity would need permission to enter. Many beds featured carved headboards with protective symbols. Hexafoils, six-petaled flowers, and daisy wheels were common motifs believed to confuse or repel night spirits. The physical environment of Tudor bedrooms contributed to these nocturnal terrors. Unlike our well-ventilated modern bedrooms, 16th-century sleeping chambers were often stuffy, with windows sealed against night air, widely believed to carry disease and evil influences. The wealthy might burn aromatic woods or herbs thought to repel evil, while poorer households may do with garlic or bundles of protective herbs hung near the bed. This poor ventilation, combined with smoke from hearths and candles, created conditions that could exacerbate breathing difficulties during sleep, likely contributing to the sensation of chest pressure associated with the night hag. Diet also played a role in these nocturnal visitations. The evening meal was often the largest of the day, and for those who could afford it, might include heavy meats, bread, and alcohol, particularly ale or wine. Digesting such meals while lying in a semi-reclined position, many Tudor beds were designed for sleeping in a partially upright position, could cause indigestion and difficulty breathing, physical sensations that reinforced the night hag narrative. The Tudor understanding of sleep itself differed markedly from our own. While we view sleep as a single extended period, evidence suggests many Europeans of this era practiced segmented sleep, sleeping first for a few hours after dusk, called first sleep, then waking for a period of quiet activity before returning to second sleep until dawn. This waking period between sleeps was often considered a vulnerable time when supernatural forces were particularly active, and many reported experiencing night hag attacks during this transition. The night hag was thought to target certain individuals more frequently than others. Those who had sinned or failed in their religious devotions were considered particularly vulnerable. Young women of marriageable age were also believed to be frequent targets, with the hag sometimes interpreted as a jealous supernatural entity attempting to sap their youth and beauty. Pregnant women feared the hag most of all, as it was thought that the creature could cause miscarriage or steal the unborn child's life force. The noted physician Andrew Boord, in his 1547 Dietary of Health, offered advice for those suffering from night hag attacks. If a man be combrade, troubled by the night hagger, let him put his hand before his face, and let him blow upon his hand, and then the night hagger will come no more to him. This remedy, along with countless others, reveals the deeply held belief that these were physical, not purely psychological, encounters that could be warded off through specific actions. Some Tudor remedies for night hag visitations strike us as strange today. Leaving sharp objects near the bed, scissors open to form a cross, knives or iron nails, was thought to repel the hag, who feared iron and sharp edges. Others placed a broom by the bedroom door, believing the hag would be compelled to count every straw before entering, thus protecting the sleeper until dawn. These practices reveal the complex mythology surrounding this nocturnal visitor. She was powerful, but bound by certain rules and limitations that clever humans could exploit. The gendering of the night hag is particularly interesting. While the entity was almost universally depicted as female, there existed male counterparts, particularly the incubus, a male demon believed to seduce women in their sleep. The predominance of female imagery in these nocturnal terrors reflect broader societal anxieties about women's power in Tudor England, particularly older women who lived alone and might be suspected of witchcraft. Indeed, many accused witches of the period were said to transform into night hags to torment their neighbours. As you lie in your bed tonight, perhaps you'll briefly consider how fortunate you are to understand the scientific explanation behind sleep paralysis. The Tudor sleeper had no such comfort, believing with absolute certainty that malevolent entities prowled the night, seeking entry to their sleeping chambers. But here's a curious thought to ponder as you drift toward sleep. Might there be aspects of our nocturnal experience that our own science has yet to fully explain? What phenomena might future generations look back on with the same bemused understanding with which we regard the night hag? For the Tudor mind, the boundary between the natural and supernatural was permeable, particularly in the vulnerable state between wakefulness and sleep. The night hag stood at this threshold, a terrifying embodiment of the unknown that awaited in the darkness beyond the candle's glow. What other nocturnal spirits populated this shadow realm, and what protective measures did our ancestors take against them? That is a question we shall explore as our journey through the night terrors of 16th century Europe continues. While the night hag was feared throughout Tudor England, a rich tapestry of protective measures evolved to defend against her terrifying nocturnal visits. These defenses weren't merely superstitious habits, but formed an elaborate system of protective magic that combined pre-Christian folk practices with Christian symbolism, a reflection of how thoroughly these belief systems had intertwined in the popular mind by the 16th century. The most basic protection against the night hag began with the preparation of the bedroom itself. A proper Tudor bedchamber required careful arrangement to minimize supernatural risk. Beds were positioned to avoid direct alignment with doors or windows through which evil influences might easily enter. Windows were often marked with protective symbols, small crosses scratched into the lead between panes, or marks known as witch marks or apotropaic marks carved into window frames and sills. These marks, many of which can still be seen in surviving Tudor buildings today, included daisy wheels, pentangles, and endless knots designed to confuse and entrap evil spirits. The spirit enters through openings, wrote theologian Heinrich Kramer in his infamous witch-hunting manual Malleus Maleficarum, which remained influential throughout the 16th century. Thus must all entrances be guarded against their incursion. This belief led to elaborate rituals of sealing thresholds. Doorways were particularly vulnerable points requiring special protection. Many households placed iron horseshoes above door lintels. The association between iron and protection against supernatural forces was deeply rooted, with iron's ability to withstand fire, making it symbolically powerful against demons associated with hellfire. Master carpenter Thomas Darcy, whose account books from 1567 detail work on several Essex manor houses, recorded charges for carving protective devices upon bed frames and chamber doors, as requested by the lady of the house. These carvings typically included motifs like the endless knot, continuous line patterns that were believed to confuse and trap malevolent entities like the night hag, who would become lost following the unbroken lines. Perhaps the most powerful protective symbol was the hexafoil or daisy wheel, a six-petaled, flower-like design created with compass and ruler. Archaeologists have discovered these marks scratched into the plaster around Tudor fireplaces, window frames, and especially around beds. The symbol's power lay partly in its geometric perfection, which was thought to reflect divine order against chaotic evil, and partly in its endless nature. The night hag would supposedly be compelled to trace the pattern endlessly, preventing her from attacking the sleeper. Beyond physical markings, Tudor sleepers employed numerous objects for protection. Iron was particularly valued. Small iron trinkets might be sewn into pillows or mattresses, while more affluent households might possess elaborate wrought iron candle holders positioned strategically around the bed. A Tudor physician's casebook from 1583 recommends, "For those troubled by the nightmare, place a knife with a black handle beneath the pillow and hang a piece of flint with a natural hole through it above the bed. Such holy stones, naturally occurring stones with holes worn through them by water, were highly prized protective objects throughout England. Often called hag stones, they were believed to allow the sleeper to see through the disguises of supernatural entities." Lady Anne Clifford, a noblewoman whose detailed diaries provide valuable insights into Tudor aristocratic life, recorded in 1603 how she kept a stone with a hole found upon the shore at Whitby, suspended on a cord, above her bed as a sovereign protection against night spirits. Botanical protections were equally important. Herbs with protective properties were bundled and hung near beds or stuffed into pillows. St. John's wort, gathered on Midsummer Eve, when its powers were believed strongest, was particularly valued for its ability to repel demons. Verbena, lavender, and rowan berries were also common protective herbs. For the wealthy, these might be contained in small embroidered sachets, while humbler households used simple cloth bundles tied with red thread, the colour red having its own protective associations. A Tudor herbalist's manuscript from 1559 offers this advice: "Against the nightmare and evil spirits that trouble men or women in their sleep, take of the herb called Fuga Daemonum, St. John's wort, and hang it about the neck of the afflicted person, or place it fresh under the pillow each fortnight when the moon wanes." Religious protection formed another crucial layer of defence. While the Reformation brought significant changes to English religious practice during the 16th century, belief in supernatural threats remained consistent across both Catholic and Protestant households. Catholics might place blessed objects near the bed. Medals of St. Benedict, who was particularly associated with protection against demons, or small containers of holy water. Protestants, while rejecting such popish practices, substituted their own forms of spiritual protection, particularly scripture verses written on paper and placed beneath pillows. The Lord's Prayer was considered especially powerful when recited before sleep. Many Tudor prayer books include specific bedtime prayers designed to ward off nocturnal attacks. A 1562 prayer book includes this sleep preparation. "Visit, we beseech thee, O Lord, this dwelling, and drive far from it all snares of the enemy. Let thy holy angels dwell herein to preserve us in peace, and may thy blessing be upon us always." For those of sufficient means, sleeping positions themselves provided another layer of protection. The most secure position was thought to be on one's right side, with hands crossed over the chest or folded in prayer. Sleeping face down was considered dangerous as it exposed the back, and thus the spine and soul, to attack. Similarly, sleeping face up invited the night hag to sit upon the chest. Tudor beds were often designed for a semi-reclined position rather than lying flat, a posture that made breathing easier and was thought to reduce vulnerability to supernatural attack. The physician Thomas Cogan, in his 1584 work, The Haven of Health, advised, "The best manner of lying is first on the right side, for so the meat passes to the bottom of the stomach, after, turning to the left side, that the liver, which is on the right side, may rest upon the stomach, and somewhat heat it." This medical advice aligned neatly with supernatural concerns, creating a coherent system where health practices and spiritual protection reinforced each other. Children were considered particularly vulnerable to the night hag and received special protections. Many Tudor children slept with coral amulets, coral being prized for its protective properties, particularly for the young. A surviving letter from 1576 from a grandmother to her daughter advises, "For the child who fears the nightmare A piece of red coral wrapped in white cloth and placed beneath the pillow will guard against all harm. Baptismal gifts often included protective amulets specifically designed to protect infants during sleep. The most vulnerable time for night hag attacks was believed to be during the transition between first sleep and second sleep, that period of wakefulness in the middle of the night that was common in pre-industrial sleep patterns. This was when many reported experiencing the terrifying weight on their chest and the sensation of being unable to move or cry out. Some Tudor households practiced brief protective rituals during this midnight waking period, reciting prayers, or changing sleeping positions to renew their spiritual armor against attack. Robert Burton, whose work, The Anatomy of Melancholy, 1621, drew on earlier Tudor sources, described the night hag experience. When they lie in bed and sleep is coming upon them, they think they see one stand by them, or hear a noise, talk with them, and such like hallucinations of imagination. While Burton took a somewhat more psychological approach than his predecessors, he still acknowledged the reality of the experience for sufferers and recommended remedies including purging melancholic humors and sleeping with the head elevated. Not all protective measures were effective, however. A Sussex woman's journal from 1592 laments, "Despite the holy stone above my bed and the knife beneath my pillow, the night hag returned again last night, pressing upon my chest so I could not breathe nor cry out. I fear she grows stronger, or my protections weaker." This reveals an important aspect of Tudor supernatural belief. While protective measures were widely practiced, failure was often attributed not to the inefficacy of the method, but to its improper application, or to particularly powerful supernatural forces that required stronger countermeasures. The fear of the night hag touched all levels of society, but interpretations varied with social status. Among the educated elite, these experiences might be partially explained through humoral theory, the predominant medical framework of the time. Excess of certain humors, particularly black bile, was thought to create conditions favorable to night hag attacks. Thus, dietary adjustments and herbal remedies to balance the humors formed part of the protective regimen for the upper classes. As the shadows grow longer and you contemplate the elaborate system of protections Tudor sleepers wrapped around themselves, consider the profound anxiety that must have accompanied the nightly ritual of sleep preparation. Each object carefully positioned, each prayer meticulously recited, each herb strategically placed, all to ward off a terrifying entity that seemed to target sleepers at their most vulnerable moment. What other nocturnal entities populated their nightmare landscape, and what specific dangers did they pose to the sleeping Tudor? That is what we shall explore next as our journey through the creepiest bedtime beliefs continues. Despite the elaborate network of protective measures employed by Tudor households, the night hag continued to plague sleepers throughout the 16th century. When protections failed, as they inevitably did, given that sleep paralysis is a neurological phenomenon unaffected by herbs or prayers, the explanations and consequences could be severe and far-reaching, affecting not just individual health, but community relationships and even legal proceedings. A failed defense against the night hag raised troubling questions. Had the sufferer committed sins that weakened their spiritual armor? Had protective rituals been performed incorrectly? Or, most disturbing of all, was a particularly powerful witch targeting them specifically? This last explanation gained increasing traction as the 16th century progressed, and witch hunting further intensified across Europe. John Stanton, a village constable whose records from 1568 survive in Leicestershire archives, documented a disturbing case. Goodwife Ellen complains that for 3 nights past, the widow Cooper has come upon her in her sleep as a great weight, stopping her breath and leaving bruises upon her chest. Other neighbors report similar visitations after quarreling with the said widow. This account reveals how night hag experiences could transform into witchcraft accusations, with potentially fatal consequences for the accused. The connection between the night hag and witchcraft became increasingly codified in the latter half of the 16th century. The influential work A Discovery of Witchcraft by Reginald Scott, 1584, while actually skeptical of many witch beliefs, nonetheless documented the widespread conviction that witches could transform themselves into night hags to attack enemies during sleep. Scott wrote, "It is affirmed that these witches have carnal copulation with the devil, and such as are on familiar terms with Satan are carried about by him in the air, transformed into cats and other beasts, and become night hags that sit upon men's stomachs while they sleep." When preventative measures failed, Tudor sufferers turned to increasingly desperate remedies. Some resorted to counter-magic, practices that straddled the dangerous line between legitimate protection and potentially heretical witchcraft. These might include creating witch bottles, sealed containers filled with pins, hair, nail, clippings and urine, designed to reflect harmful magic back upon its sender. While such practices risked accusations of witchcraft themselves, the desperate might judge this a necessary risk to combat persistent night hag attacks. Medical remedies for those who had already experienced attacks focused on restoring balance to the body's humors. The physician William Bullen recommended in his Bulwark of Defense Against All Sickness, 1579, for those afflicted by the nightmare, a purging of black bile is necessary, followed by strengthening cordials of rose water and gold leaf to restore the spirits. Such treatments, expensive and available only to the wealthy, combined humoral theory with the symbolic power of precious materials. For the less affluent, folk remedies predominated. A surviving household manual from 1587 suggests, to cure one who hath been ridden by the hag, make a salve of hen's grease mixed with the herb agrimony, and anoint the chest where the hag pressed. Then let the sufferer drink a posset of warm milk, wherein 3 cloves of garlic have been steeped. Such remedies, combining practical chest treatments with protective herbs, reflect the blend of practical and supernatural thinking that characterized Tudor medicine. Sleep itself was altered when night hag attacks became frequent. Some sufferers resorted to sleeping upright in chairs, as the night hag was thought to have difficulty attacking someone who wasn't fully reclined. Others practiced what we might now call sleep deprivation, deliberately reducing sleep to avoid the vulnerable state where attacks occurred. A nobleman's letter from 1597 describes his servant's condition. The boy has taken to sleeping only in short intervals, fearing the return of the night hag that has troubled him these past fortnight. He grows pale and weak from lack of proper rest, yet fears sleep more than exhaustion. The psychological impact of repeated night hag experiences could be devastating. Unlike our modern understanding of sleep paralysis as a temporary and harmless, if frightening, neurological event, Tudor sufferers experience these episodes as genuine supernatural assaults that threaten not just their physical health, but their spiritual well-being and potentially their very souls. Contemporary accounts describe victims becoming withdrawn, fearful of sleep, and increasingly isolated, symptoms we might now associate with anxiety disorders or PTSD. Religious authorities offered their own remedies when protections failed. Catholic priests might perform exorcism rituals for the afflicted bedchamber, while Protestant ministers emphasized increased prayer, Bible reading, and moral reformation. Bishop James Pilkington, in his Exposition upon Nehemiah, the 1585, advised, "Those troubled by night spirits should examine their conscience for unconfessed sin, for the devil preys upon the guilty soul that has not sought proper absolution." The social dimension of night hag attacks reveals much about Tudor community dynamics. When protective measures failed, sufferers often looked beyond their own households for causes and culprits. Local women who fit the profile of the stereotypical witch, elderly, widowed, socially marginal, became targets of suspicion, particularly if they had been involved in recent disputes with the afflicted. Court records from the period reveal numerous cases where night hag experiences formed part of the evidence in witchcraft prosecutions. The gendered nature of these accusations is striking. While both men and women reported experiencing night hag attacks, the alleged perpetrators were overwhelmingly female. This reflects broader patterns in witch accusations throughout the period, where women constituted the vast majority of the accused. The night hag thus became one manifestation of broader societal anxieties about female power and autonomy in Tudor England. Failed protections could lead to community-wide responses. If multiple households reported night hag attacks, village authorities might organize collective rituals of protection, processions around the settlement boundaries, special church services, or community fasting. A parish record from 1589 describes how the whole village gathered to pray against the night spirits that had troubled many sleepers, with special prayers led by the minister and a collection taken to purchase protective candles for each household. The impact of night hag beliefs extended beyond the immediate suffering of the afflicted. As the night hag became increasingly associated with witchcraft, communities began to fracture along lines of suspicion and accusation. Those who claimed to have special knowledge of protective measures gained influence, while those suspected of being night hags faced ostracism or worse. In this way, a neurological phenomenon interpreted through a supernatural lens reshaped social relationships and community power structures. By the late 16th century, some educated voices began to offer alternative explanations for night hag experiences. The physician Thomas Cogan suggested in The Haven of Health that certain foods could predispose sleepers to such attacks. The nightmare proceedeth of a vaporous humour filling the cells of the brain, which evil is increased by eating of cheese and other gross meats at supper. While still operating within the humoral framework, this explanation began to shift blame from supernatural entities to natural causes. The philosopher Michel de Montaigne, whose works were increasingly read in late Tudor England, offered an even more radical perspective, suggesting in his Essays 1580 that what were commonly called night spirits might be merely the impressions of dreams which frighten us. While such skeptical views remained minority opinions, they foreshadowed the gradual shift toward more naturalistic explanations that would emerge in subsequent centuries. For most Tudor sleepers, however, the night hag remained a terrifying reality, one that no amount of protective measures could entirely banish. Sleep itself was understood as a vulnerable state, a daily journey into a realm where malevolent forces waited for any lapse in vigilance. The terror of lying paralyzed while an evil entity pressed the life from your body shaped not just sleeping practices, but entire worldviews, reinforcing beliefs about the permeable boundary between natural and supernatural realms. As we conclude our exploration of the night hag in Tudor England, consider how profoundly different your own relationship with sleep is from that of your 16th century ancestors. Where you might worry about insomnia or snoring, they feared demonic assault. Where you might take a sleeping pill, they clutched protective herbs and amulets. Yet perhaps some echo of their nocturnal anxiety remains in our own culture's persistent fascination with things that go bump in the night. The night hag was just one of many supernatural entities that populated the Tudor dreamscape. Throughout 16th century Europe, regional variations on nocturnal spirits reflected different cultural anxieties and historical influences. How did alpine communities understand and protect against their own sleep demons? What nocturnal visitors terrorized Italian sleepers during the Renaissance? These questions await us as we continue our journey through the creepiest bedtime beliefs of 16th century Europe. High in the snow-capped alpine regions of 16th century Europe, where isolated communities clung to mountainsides and survived long, brutal winters, sleep brought its own particular terrors. While their Tudor counterparts in England feared the night hag, alpine villagers in what is now southern Germany, Austria and Switzerland dreaded visitation from a different but equally terrifying nocturnal entity. The Alpitur, the very name, whispers of something ancient and elemental, echoing the mountains themselves. Indeed, the word Alp shares linguistic roots with the name of the mountain range, both derived from ancient words meaning white or high. This connection was not coincidental. In the alpine imagination, these entities were creatures of elevation and isolation, born from the harsh mountain environment where survival was precarious and communities lived in relative isolation for months at a time during harsh winters. Unlike the night hag of England, whose appearance was consistently described as an aged crone, the Alp took various forms in alpine folklore, sometimes appearing as a misshapen dwarf with glowing eyes, other times as a beautiful youth with an unsettling smile. The Alp was more shapeshifter than fixed entity. Perhaps most disturbing was its ability to transform into a butterfly or moth that would flutter near sleeping victims before settling on their chest and transforming into a crushing weight. Hans Waldmüller, a woodcutter from the Tyrol region, recorded this experience in a letter to his brother in 1563. Last night, as the moon waxed full, I saw upon waking a pale butterfly upon the window. No sooner had I noticed it than sleep took me again, and I dreamed that a great weight sat upon my chest. Looking up, I saw a small man with eyes like glowing coals, grinning down at me as he pressed harder. I could not move nor cry out, though
I struggled mightily. Only when the cock crowed did the creature flee, leaving me bathed in sweat and trembling.
This account contains several elements typical of Alp encounters: the initial appearance as an insect, the transformation into a humanoid figure, the paralysis and pressure sensation, and the departure at cockcrow. While sharing certain features, with the night hag experience, the Alp had distinctive characteristics that reflected the specific cultural and environmental context of the alpine regions. Alpine communities existed in a landscape that was simultaneously beautiful and deadly. Avalanches, sudden storms, and treacherous passes claimed lives regularly. The thin mountain air could cause breathing difficulties and disorientation, while isolation during winter months created psychological pressures unknown in more connected lowland communities. These environmental factors shaped the Alp mythology, creating a nocturnal predator that embodied the unpredictable dangers of mountain life. Unlike the English night hag, who was primarily associated with physical attack, the Alp was believed to feed on the breath or life essence of its victims. Many accounts describe the creature placing its mouth over that of the sleeper, sucking away their breath and leaving them weakened. This vampiric aspect may relate to the real experience of altitude-related breathing difficulties, which would have been common in high alpine settlements where the air is thinner and colder. Sebastian Münster, in his Cosmographia of 1544, one of the earliest geographical works about the alpine regions, noted, "The mountain folk speak of night demons called Alpen, which sit upon the chests of sleepers and draw forth their breath, sometimes causing death if the attack persists too long. They believe these creatures dwell in the highest peaks where no man can reach, descending at night to prey upon those who sleep unprotected." The Alps' association with heights extended to its supposed habitation. while the night hag of England was thought to enter homes through keyholes or cracks, the Alp was believed to descend from mountain peaks, entering through chimneys or open windows, particularly those facing the mountains. This directional specificity led to the common practice of orienting beds away from mountain-facing walls and keeping windows on that side tightly shuttered, regardless of summer heat. Seasonal patterns shaped Alp encounters as well. Attacks were reported most frequently during winter months, when households were sealed against the cold, ventilation was poor, and families spent long hours in close proximity. The lack of fresh air, combined with smoke from hearth fires kept burning constantly for warmth, created conditions where breathing difficulties during sleep would be common, reinforcing the narrative of breath-stealing nocturnal entities. Diet also played a role in shaping Alp experiences. Winter diets in alpine regions were heavily dependent on preserved meats, aged cheeses, and limited vegetables, foods that could contribute to indigestion and disturbed sleep. A 16th-century household manual from the region of Vorarlberg advised, "To avoid visitation by the Alp, eat no strong cheese nor salted meat in the evening hours, and take a draught of warm wine with mint before retiring." The Alp differed from the night hag in another significant way. It demonstrated a disturbing preference for certain victims. Young women of marriageable age were considered particularly vulnerable, with the Alp sometimes taking on the role of a demonic lover rather than simply an attacker. Some accounts describe the entity as seductive rather than frightening, at least initially, before revealing its true deadly nature. A church record from 1581, preserved in the archives of a small alpine parish, describes the confession of a young woman. Margarita admitted that for 3 nights she had been visited by a handsome youth who entered through her window. At first, his attentions were pleasing to her, but on the 3rd night he grew heavy upon her chest, and she could not breathe, recognizing then that her visitor was no mortal man but the Alp. She has been admonished to pray for forgiveness and to place blessed objects about her bed. This sexual dimension of Alp mythology reflects societal anxieties about female sexuality and the perceived vulnerability of young women to temptation. In isolated alpine communities where marriage options were limited and closely controlled by family alliances, fears about unsanctioned sexual relationships found expression in the mythology of a supernatural seducer who targeted young women in their beds. The Alp's ability to shapeshift, particularly into butterflies or moths, connected it to the ancient soul beliefs of the region. In pre-Christian alpine mythology, butterflies were associated with souls and transformation. This association persisted in Christian times, with the Alp representing a corrupted or damned soul that preyed upon the living. Some regional variations held that the Alps were the spirits of unbaptized children or suicides, doomed to wander the mountains and feed on the life force of sleepers. Physical environment shaped Alp experiences as well. Alpine homes were built to withstand severe weather, with small windows and low ceilings that trapped heat, but also created stuffy sleeping conditions. Many families slept in the same room as their livestock during winter months, with animals kept on the ground floor for additional warmth. While practical for survival, these arrangements created poor air quality that could contribute to breathing difficulties and disturbed sleep, experiences that reinforced Alp mythology. Mountain weather patterns may have further contributed to Alp encounters. The foehn, a warm, dry wind that descends from alpine slopes, is known to cause headaches, insomnia, and anxiety in sensitive individuals. Modern medical research has documented the foehn illness phenomenon with symptoms including disturbed sleep and feelings of pressure or discomfort. For 16th-century alpine dwellers experiencing these weather-related effects, the Alp provided an explanatory framework. Alpine communities developed their own distinctive protective measures against the Alp, reflecting the specific characteristics attributed to this regional sleep demon. Unlike the English, who favoured iron implements and herbs, Alpine protections centred on light, mirrors, and blessed objects. The Alp was believed to fear its own reflection, leading to the practice of placing small mirrors near beds. Similarly, leaving a small lamp burning through the night was thought to deter the creature, who preferred darkness for its attacks. A household inventory from a prosperous Alpine farm in 1567 lists among its possessions: 1 silver mirror for protection against the Alp, placed at the bedhead. This expensive protective item suggests the seriousness with which even wealthy households took the threat of nocturnal attack. For less affluent families, polished metal or water in a reflective bowl might serve the same purpose. Religious protections took on regional characteristics as well. Alpine communities, predominantly Catholic despite the spreading influence of Protestantism in the 16th century, relied heavily on blessed objects for protection. The Agnus Dei, a small wax disc bearing the image of the Lamb of God and blessed by the Pope, was particularly valued as a defense against the Alp. These would be placed near beds or worn around the neck during sleep. A physician's record from Innsbruck in 1570 notes, "For protection against the Alp that sits upon sleepers, the mountain folk hang blessed medals above their beds and place branches of alpine plants, particularly edelweiss and gentian, beneath their pillows. They believe these mountain flowers, growing close to heaven, have special power against the mountain demons." As you consider the terror that must have gripped Alpine sleepers as they prepared for bed each night, their small windows tightly shuttered against both physical cold and supernatural threat, it's worth noting how environment shapes not just practical aspects of sleep, but its very mythology. The same neurological phenomenon, sleep paralysis, took on distinctive characteristics in the Alpine region, reflecting the unique geographic, climatic, and cultural features of mountain life. The Alp represented a manifestation of the precariousness
of existence in the high mountains, the constant awareness that survival balanced on a knife's edge, with death only a missed step or sudden storm away.
Unlike lowland communities with their different rhythms and dangers, Alpine villages faced isolation and environmental extremes that shaped their collective imagination and their particular nocturnal fears. What deeper cultural factors influenced the development of the Alp mythology? How did these beliefs interact with religious authorities and medical practitioners of the region? And what happened when traditional protections failed to prevent an Alp attack? These questions await us as we continue our exploration of this fascinating Alpine sleep demon. The geographical setting of Alpine communities, positioned literally between earth and sky, created a unique spiritual landscape where the Alp mythology flourished. Unlike lowland regions with their expansive horizons, Alpine villages existed in valleys overshadowed by towering peaks, creating a physical environment where the boundary between terrestrial and celestial realms seemed more permeable. This liminal quality extended to the Alp itself, a creature believed to inhabit a threshold space between the material and spiritual worlds. The distinctive spiritual environment of Alpine regions was shaped by several factors. Christianity arrived relatively late to these remote mountain areas, and when it did, it absorbed rather than erased many pre-Christian beliefs. The result was a syncretic spiritual system where official Catholic doctrine coexisted with older Alpine animistic traditions. Church authorities, recognizing the practical challenges of enforcing orthodox belief in such isolated regions, often adopted a pragmatic approach to local customs, particularly those related to protection against supernatural threats. Father Johannes Praetorius, a parish priest in the Tyrolean Alps, wrote in his journal in 1568, "The mountain folk cling to many old ways in their dealings with night spirits. While I encourage proper Christian devotions, I do not forbid their hanging of mirrors or alpine flowers, for these harm no one and bring comfort to the fearful. Better they should use these alongside their prayers than abandon prayer entirely for pagan protections. This accommodation created a rich, protective tradition that blended Christian and pre-Christian elements. Crucifixes would be positioned near beds alongside alpine herbs. Prayers to the Virgin Mary might be recited while arranging protective mirrors. This theological flexibility reflected the practical realities of mountain life, where survival required adaptation and resourcefulness. The Alp itself occupied an ambiguous position in alpine cosmology. Unlike demons or devils, who were unambiguously evil in Christian theology, the Alp was understood as a more complex entity, something between a nature spirit and a damned soul. Some regional variations held that Alps were the spirits of people who had committed specific sins, particularly related to pride or envy. Others believed they were nature spirits corrupted by dark influences, or even human sorcerers who had gained the ability to transform themselves through forbidden knowledge. A manuscript from a monastery near Salzburg, dated 1554, describes this ambiguity. The creature called Alp by the common folk is neither holy demon nor holy ghost, but partakes of both natures. It cannot be banished by exorcism alone, nor by the methods used against common ghosts. It requires specific protections drawing upon both divine grace and the natural virtues of certain mountain plants and stones. This ontological ambiguity made the Alp particularly frightening. Demons could be exorcised through established church rituals. Ghosts could be laid to rest by addressing their unfinished business. But the Alp existed outside these categories, requiring specialized knowledge that combined Christian and folk traditions. This gave rise to local specialists, individuals with reputation for knowledge of Alp-repelling techniques, who occupied an unofficial but important role in alpine communities. Maria Kessler, known in her Bavarian alpine community as the Wise Woman of Oberammergau, left a small handbook of protective practices dated 1575. Her recommendations reveal the blend of traditions used against the Alp. For protection, hang a mirror facing the window through which the Alp enters. Beneath your pillow, place 3 flowers of Edelweiss, gathered at noon on a clear day, tied with red thread, blessed by a priest. Recite the prayer to St. Barbara 3 times before sleep, and keep a blessed candle burning through the night. The significance of light in alpine protection strategies is particularly noteworthy. While Tudor English protections against the night hag emphasized physical barriers and apotropaic objects, alpine defenses centered on illumination. This may relate to the extreme darkness of winter nights in deep alpine valleys where the sun might be visible for only a few hours each day. In this context, light itself became sacred, a defense against both physical and spiritual darkness. Alpine communities developed elaborate rituals around light production and preservation. Special candles blessed during Candlemas, February 2, were carefully preserved throughout the year to be lit only during thunderstorms or when Alp attacks were feared. These weather candles, or Alp candles, combined practical illumination with spiritual protection. Some households maintained a continuous flame throughout winter months, with family members taking turns to ensure it never extinguished, a practice that served both practical warming needs and supernatural protection. A household account book from a prosperous Alpine farm in 1563 records 3 pounds of finest beeswax purchased for Alp candles to be blessed at Candlemas and kept ready for protection throughout the year. The significant expense represented by this purchase, beeswax being far costlier than tallow, indicates the seriousness with which even wealthy households took the threat of Alp attacks. The mirror as protective device had particular significance in Alpine folklore. Unlike English protections, which focused on repelling or trapping the night hag, mirrors were thought to force the Alp to confront its own nature. According to regional beliefs, the Alp could not bear to see its reflection, because it revealed its true demonic form, which it otherwise could disguise. Some accounts claim that an Alp forced to view its reflection would flee immediately and never return to that household. Church records from a small parish in what is now South Tyrol describe a case from 1577. The widow Greta sought advice for her daughter, who was visited nightly by the Alp and growing weak from its attacks. The priest blessed a silver mirror, which was placed facing the bed. That same night, the household was awakened by a terrible shriek, and the daughter reported seeing a twisted creature fleeing through her window after catching sight of itself in the mirror. No further attacks have occurred. A farmer's almanac from 1582 advises, to protect cattle from the Alp, hang a mirror in the stable and place iron horseshoes above each stall. Twine red thread around the horns of cows and never leave a bucket of water uncovered in the stable at night, lest the Alp use it as a gateway. These protective measures for livestock paralleled those used for humans, reflecting the integrated nature of human-animal relationships in alpine communities. The alpine region's proximity to multiple cultural influences created significant regional variations in Alp beliefs. In Germanic areas, the Alp was often associated with fallen nature spirits or the souls of unbaptized children. In areas closer to Italian influence, the Alp took on characteristics similar to the incubus or succubus, with stronger sexual overtones. In Slavic-influenced Eastern Alpine regions, the Alp shared features with the Mora or Zmora, Slavic nightmare entities that similarly attacked sleepers. Matthias Merian, a Swiss engraver whose work Topographia documented Alpine regions, in the early 17th century, drawing on 16th century sources, noted these variations. In the eastern valleys they speak of the Trud rather than the Alp, while to the south the creature is called Mar. Though the names differ, the accounts are similar, a being that sits upon sleepers and causes distress. Only the protections vary by region, each place having its own traditions against these night torments. What remains consistent across these regional variations is the fundamental experience of sleep paralysis interpreted through a supernatural framework shaped by specific cultural and environmental factors. As modern neurological understanding would explain, the core phenomenon remains the same, but the interpretive overlay, the specific features attributed to the attacking entity, reflects local cultural patterns. The relationship between Alp beliefs and official religious authorities was complex. While the Catholic Church dominated Alpine regions in the 16th century, its representatives took varying approaches to local Alp folklore. Some priests integrated Alp protections into official religious practices, blessing mirrors or herbs specifically for this purpose. Others attempted to reframe Alp attacks as demonic temptations requiring standard Christian remedies like prayer and confession. Still others took a more skeptical approach, suggesting natural causes for what villagers interpreted as supernatural attacks. A letter from a bishop to parish priests in his Alpine diocese, dated 1567, reveals this complexity. Reports have reached us of various practices against the so-called Alp that troubles sleepers. Where these involve prayer, blessed objects, and virtuous living, they may be encouraged. Where they involve suspicious practices or objects not blessed by the Church, gentle correction should be offered. Remember that these mountain communities face many hardships and fears, approach their beliefs with patience rather than harsh condemnation. As we conclude this exploration of the cultural and spiritual context of Alp beliefs, consider how environment shapes not just practical aspects of human life, but our deepest fears and the frameworks we create to explain disturbing experiences. The Alpine Alp, with its distinctive characteristics and the specialized protections developed against it, reveals how a universal human neurological experience can be interpreted through highly specific cultural lenses. What happened when traditional protections failed? How did alpine communities respond to persistent Alp attacks, and what consequences might befall those suspected of being an Alp? These questions await us as we continue our journey through one of the creepiest bedtime beliefs of 16th century Europe. When traditional protections against the Alp failed, as they inevitably did, given the neurological nature of sleep paralysis, alpine communities faced a troubling dilemma. Unlike the English night hag, which was generally conceptualized as a purely supernatural entity, the Alp occupied an ambiguous position between spirit and human. This ambiguity created space for a particularly disturbing belief that certain individuals within the community could transform themselves into Alps and attack their neighbors during sleep. This belief emerged from several aspects of Alp mythology. The creature's shape-shifting abilities, its targeted attacks on specific individuals, and its apparent knowledge of household layouts all suggested a familiarity that could be explained if the Alp was, in fact, someone known to its victims. By the mid-16th century, this suspicion had developed into a coherent theory in many alpine communities that certain people, through either innate abilities or dark practices, could transform themselves at night and prey upon their neighbors. Judicial record from 1573, preserved in archives near Innsbruck, documents this belief in action. Hans Gruber accuses his neighbor, the widow Elsa, of coming to him as an Alp for 3 nights past, sitting upon his chest and stealing his breath until he nearly died. He claims to have recognized her face when the moonlight struck the creature, and notes that she has long held grievance against him over a boundary dispute. Such accusations shared similarities with witchcraft charges but remained distinct in important ways. While witchcraft was understood as a deliberate pact with the devil, Alp transformation was sometimes believed to be an involuntary condition, something the accused might not even be aware of doing. Some regional folklore held that individuals born with certain characteristics, red hair, joined eyebrows, or being the 7th son or daughter, might transform into Alps while their conscious minds slept. A physician's casebook from 1568 records a troubling case. A young man of 20 years came to me in great distress, believing himself to be an Alp by night, though he has no memory of transformation. He reports waking with grass stains on his feet and dirt under his nails, and fears he may have attacked his neighbors unwittingly. I prescribed valerian root to be taken before sleep, and advised confession to ease his troubled conscience. Is this a concept of involuntary transformation created complex moral and legal questions? If someone could become an Alp without conscious intent, were they culpable for actions performed in this state? Local courts struggled with such cases, developing various tests and procedures to determine guilt. These ranged from searching for physical marks on the accused's body to elaborate sleep-watching rituals where suspicious individuals would be monitored through the night to see if their spirit departed. A magistrate's handbook from Bavaria, dated 1581, offers guidance. In cases where a person is accused of being an Alp, evidence must be stronger than mere dreams or sensations of the accuser. Look for evidence of night wandering, unusual knowledge of the accuser's home interior, or the accused being found inexplicably asleep during daylight hours when the attacks are said to occur at night. Be wary of accusations stemming from existing disputes or enmities. This last point highlights an important aspect of Alp accusations. They often mapped onto existing social tensions. Those accused of being Alps were typically individuals who already occupied marginalized positions within alpine communities. Widows living alone, individuals with physical deformities, newcomers not fully integrated into community networks, or those involved in ongoing disputes with their accusers. A survey of Alp-related legal cases from 16th-century Alpine regions reveals that approximately 70% of the accused were women, with elderly widows forming the largest subgroup. This gendered pattern mirrors broader witch persecution trends of the period, reflecting how supernatural accusations often reinforced existing social hierarchies and provided mechanisms for controlling those perceived as problematic or threatening to community norms. The consequences for those accused of being an Alp varied widely depending on local legal traditions, the specific nature of the accusation, and the social standing of both accuser and accused. In some jurisdictions, particularly those with stronger central authority and more educated magistrates, accusations might be dismissed as superstition or redirected toward medical explanations. In more isolated communities with stronger traditional beliefs, the consequences could be severe, ranging from social ostracism to physical punishment or even execution in extreme cases. A court sentence from 1579 in a small Alpine community demonstrates the potential severity. Margareta Weber, having been found guilty of transforming herself into an Alp and attacking her neighbors by night, causing the death of 2 children through suffocation, is hereby sentenced to be burned until dead. Her ashes shall be scattered on the north side of the mountain, where the sun never shines, to prevent her spirit from returning. However, such extreme punishments were relatively rare for Alp accusations alone. More commonly, those accused faced less severe but still significant consequences, being forced to leave the community, having their property confiscated, or being subjected to public penance and monitoring. Some were required to wear identifying markers or observe curfews, preventing them from being abroad during night hours when transformations were believed to occur. For those who genuinely believed themselves to be involuntary Alps, a phenomenon documented in several sources that the psychological burden could be devastating. These individuals often sought help from both religious and medical authorities, desperate to end their supposed nocturnal transformations. Their suffering represents a particularly poignant aspect of Alp beliefs, the internalization of supernatural, explanation to the point where it became part of personal identity. A confession recorded by a parish priest in 1584 reveals this psychological dimension. Anna came to me in tears, believing her soul leaves her body as an Alp while she sleeps. She reports dreams of flying through windows and sitting on sleepers and is terrified she has harmed her neighbors. I have prescribed prayers and fasting and advised her to secure herself to her bed with blessed cords to prevent her spirit from wandering. Medical practitioners of the period offered their own explanations and remedies for both Alp attacks and the condition of being an Alp. Drawing on humoral theory, the dominant medical framework of the time, physicians typically attributed both experiences to imbalances of black bile or melancholy humor. This explanation provided a path for treatment through dietary adjustments, herbal remedies, and lifestyle changes intended to restore humoral balance. Paracelsus, the influential Swiss physician whose work transformed 16th-century medicine, addressed the Alp phenomenon in his writings, suggesting it resulted from vapors arising from the stomach to the brain during sleep, causing pressure sensations and fearful visions. His recommended treatments included purging remedies to cleanse the digestive system, along with amulets containing specific minerals thought to counteract these vapors. Local healers developed specialized treatments for those who believed themselves to be involuntary Alps. These often combined physical restraint, tying the person to their bed with special cords or chains, with herbal remedies intended to anchor the spirit to the body during sleep. Common ingredients included valerian root, known for its sedative properties, and heavy alpine minerals like iron pyrite or lead, thought to weigh down the spirit and prevent transformation. A healer's recipe book from 1565 contains this treatment. For one who becomes an Alp unwillingly, make a poultice of valerian root, lady's mantle, and iron filings mixed with sheep's fat. Apply to the soles of the feet before sleep, and bind the wrists and ankles with red cord that has been blessed. Place a heavy stone upon the chest, and the spirit cannot rise from the body. For the wider community, the belief that neighbors might transform into Alps created a climate of suspicion and fear that could persist for generations. Unlike witchcraft accusations, which typically targeted specific individuals, Alp suspicions could attach to entire families, with the ability to transform believed to pass from parent to child. This created enduring stigma for certain lineages, who might face ongoing discrimination regardless of individual behavior. A local history compiled in 1590 notes, the Hofer family has long been suspected of the Alp nature, this suspicion falling upon them since their ancestor, Klaus, was accused, 3 generations past. Though no formal charges have been brought in recent memory, few will share food with them or allow their children to marry into the line, fearing the Alp nature may be passed to offspring. The geographic isolation of alpine communities intensified these dynamics. In regions where families might live in the same valleys for centuries with limited outside contact, supernatural accusations became embedded in community memory and identity. Village nicknames, property boundaries, and marriage patterns could all be shaped by long-standing beliefs about which families carried Alp blood or had been touched by the mountain spirits. Religious reforms of the 16th century, particularly the spread of Protestantism to some alpine regions, brought new perspectives on Alp beliefs. Protestant authorities, while not dismissing supernatural possibilities entirely, were generally more skeptical of folk traditions and more likely to attribute such experiences to either natural causes or direct demonic influence, rather than the complex hybrid entity of Alpine Catholic tradition. A Protestant pastor's letter from 1588, addressed to a newly converted Alpine community, demonstrates this shift. These beliefs in Alps and night flyers are remnants of papist superstition. The scripture teaches that Satan may trouble our sleep, but not through these imagined transformations. Direct your fear toward God alone and seek protection in prayer and righteous living rather than mirrors and herbs. By the late 16th century, elite opinion was beginning to shift toward more naturalistic explanations of Alp experiences, at least among educated physicians and magistrates. However, for most alpine villagers, the Alp remained a terrifying reality, a creature that embodied the precarious nature of mountain life and the thin boundary between human and supernatural realms. The persistence of Alp beliefs long after other supernatural entities faded from serious consideration reveals how thoroughly this mythology resonated with alpine experience. The isolation of mountain communities, the extreme seasonal variations in daylight, the breathing difficulties associated with altitude and poor ventilation, and the psychological pressure of long winters created ideal conditions for sleep disturbances that could be interpreted as supernatural attacks. As you contemplate the complex interweaving of neurological experience, cultural interpretation, and social dynamics that shape the Alp phenomenon, consider how our own understanding of sleep continues to evolve. While we might explain sleep paralysis through neural mechanisms rather than supernatural entities, the experience itself remains consistent across centuries. The sensation of wakefulness combined with immobility, often accompanied by hallucinations and pressure sensations. The Alpine Alp, with its distinctive characteristics and complex social implications, represents just one regional variation on how 16th century Europeans interpreted these universal human experiences. How did Mediterranean cultures understand similar phenomena? What nocturnal entities troubled the sleep of Italian villagers during this same period? These questions await us as we continue our exploration of the creepiest bedtime beliefs of 16th century Europe. As the Alpine villager feared the Alp and the English peasant dreaded the night hag, the inhabitants of 16th century Mediterranean regions, particularly Italy, southern France and Spain, lived in terror of their own distinctive nocturnal visitors, the incubus and its female counterpart, the succubus. These entities represented a unique fusion of ancient pagan beliefs, medieval demonology, and Renaissance medical theories, creating a nocturnal threat that attacked not just through physical pressure, but through the dangerous territory of sexual desire. The Mediterranean incubus differed significantly from its northern European counterparts. Where the night hag was primarily associated with crushing pressure and breath-stealing, and the Alp with transformation and life-force draining, the incubus and succubus were explicitly sexual entities. The male incubus was believed to sexually assault female sleepers, while the female succubus targeted men. This sexual dimension reflected distinctive cultural anxieties in Mediterranean societies, where concerns about lineage purity, female virtue, and male potency shaped social structures. Julia Francesca, a noblewoman from Florence, recorded this disturbing experience in her private diary in 1567. Last night as I slept I felt a weight upon me and opened my eyes to behold a handsome youth with eyes that burned like coals. Though I tried to cry out, no sound would come. The demon pressed himself against me in the manner of a husband with his wife, his touch both repulsive and yet stirring shameful sensations. Only when I managed to form the name of the Virgin in my mind did he vanish, leaving me in a state of terror and confusion. I have confessed this experience, though the priest assured me I bear no guilt for what was done against my will. This account contains elements common to incubus narratives from the period: the paralysis, the demonic yet attractive appearance of the entity, the explicitly sexual nature of the attack, the conflicted feelings of the victim, and the eventual banishment through divine invocation. Such experiences were widely reported throughout Mediterranean regions, creating significant spiritual and psychological distress for those who experienced them. The incubus and succubus had ancient roots in Mediterranean culture. References to sexual demon attacks appear in sources from ancient Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, suggesting the remarkable persistence of this belief pattern across millennia. By the 16th century, these ancient concepts had been thoroughly integrated into Christian demonology, creating entities that were understood as demons specifically tasked with tempting humans through sexual means. The influential Dominican theologians Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, in their witch-hunting manual Malleus Maleficarum, 1486, which remained highly influential throughout the 16th century, dedicated substantial sections to incubi and succubi. They explained, devils do not have bodies that can naturally produce semen, but they can collect human semen as succubi and then, transforming themselves into incubi, deposit this semen into women. In this way, they may produce human offspring, though such children are always tainted by their demonic conception. This complex theology created particular anxiety around incubus attacks, not just the violation itself, but the possibility of demonic impregnation. Medieval and Renaissance literature contains numerous stories of children supposedly conceived through incubus fathers, including the legendary Merlin of Arthurian tales. This belief created profound anxiety for women who experienced what we would now recognize as sleep paralysis with sexual hallucinations. They feared not just the attack itself, but potential pregnancy with a half-demon child. The Mediterranean incubus was typically described as handsome, but with subtle, inhuman features, unusually cold skin, excessive weight despite appearing normal-sized, or distinctive anatomical abnormalities that revealed its demonic nature. Some accounts mention cloven feet hidden beneath fine clothing, eyes that glowed in darkness, or breath that smelled of sulfur. The succubus similarly appeared as an attractive woman but with telltale demonic features that became apparent during the encounter. A physician's casebook from Naples, dated 1573, records a patient's experience. The merchant Giovanni reports visitations by a beautiful woman who enters through his window at night and lies with him as a wife would. He notes that though her face and form are pleasing, her touch is cold as marble, and when he embraces her, she feels unnaturally heavy. He has awakened exhausted after these encounters, feeling as though his very life essence has been drained away. I have prescribed crushed coral in wine and advised him to marry without delay, as these visitations often plague unmarried men. The belief that incubi and succubi drained vital energy through sexual contact created a medical dimension to these encounters. Within humoral theory, semen was understood as a concentrated form of life essence, particularly rich in the vital heat that sustained life. Excessive loss of semen, whether through voluntary or involuntary means, was thought to deplete this vital heat, potentially leading to illness or death. Thus, repeated succubus attacks were believed to physically weaken male victims, eventually leading to their demise if the visits continued unchecked. For women, incubus attacks carried different but equally serious medical concerns. Physicians of the period believed that female sexual arousal, even involuntary, involved the production of a female seed that, like male semen, contained vital energy. An incubus was thought to either steal this feminine essence or corrupt it through demonic influence, potentially causing various gynecological ailments or melancholy disorders. Some medical texts also suggested that the unnatural cold of the demon could congeal the womb, leading to infertility or difficult pregnancies. The renowned physician Girolamo Fracastoro, in his 1546 medical treatise, offered this explanation. Those who suffer visitations from incubi or succubi often display symptoms of melancholy, weakness, and wasting. This occurs because these demons feed upon the vital spirits contained within the generative fluids, leaving the victim depleted. Such attacks most commonly afflict those already predisposed to melancholic humors, particularly those who sleep in supine positions that allow blood to pool in the back and generate melancholic vapors that rise to the brain. The Mediterranean sleeping environment contributed to these experiences in several ways. Unlike Northern Europe, where cold temperatures encouraged shared sleeping arrangements for warmth, Mediterranean households often had more separated sleeping quarters, particularly among the upper classes. This created conditions where individuals might sleep alone, a situation that both increased vulnerability to sleep paralysis, lacking a partner who might disturb one during an episode, and provided the privacy in which sexual attack narratives could develop without immediate contradiction. Architectural features played a role as well. Mediterranean dwellings typically featured larger windows than northern homes, designed to catch cooling breezes during hot weather. These windows, often left open during summer nights, created both a physical entry point for supposed demons and exposed sleepers to moonlight, which was believed to have potentially harmful influences on the sleeping brain, making it more susceptible to supernatural attack. Diet also contributed to incubus and succubus experiences. Mediterranean cuisine, rich in wine, aged cheeses, and fermented foods, contained substances that modern science recognizes can affect sleep quality. Wine, consumed widely as a safer alternative to potentially contaminated water, could disrupt sleep cycles and contribute to vivid dreams and hallucinations. Many Mediterranean medical texts advised against consuming certain foods before sleep, particularly those considered heating to the humors, as they were thought to increase vulnerability to nocturnal demons. A household medical guide from Venice, published in 1561, advised, to avoid visitation, by incubi or succubi, eat lightly in the evening, avoiding wine, aged cheese, and spiced meats, all of which heat the blood and generate vapors that rise to the brain during sleep. Instead, take a small portion of lettuce with vinegar, which cools the humors and promotes restful sleep without troubling visions. Unlike the relatively straightforward protective measures used against the night hag or alp, defenses against the incubus and succubus involved complex moral and spiritual dimensions. Since these entities operated through sexual temptation, allegedly targeting existing desires within the victim, protection required not just physical objects, but moral purification. Confessors and spiritual advisors typically recommended prayer, fasting, and sexual abstinence, even within marriage, for periods before sleep as the first line of defense. A spiritual manual from 1558, written by a Spanish Dominican friar, instructed, "Those troubled by night demons of a lustful nature must purify themselves through confession, mortification of the flesh, and constant prayer. Sleep with the hands crossed over the chest, in the manner of a corpse in the grave, for this position signifies death to carnal desires. Place a crucifix upon the breast, and keep holy water near, to sprinkle upon yourself, should you feel the demons approach." Physical protection supplemented these spiritual practices. Mediterranean protective traditions emphasized blessed objects rather than the folk remedies common in northern regions. Holy water, blessed candles, and religious medals were standard protections, along with written prayers placed beneath pillows. Some households maintained small household shrines in or near bedrooms, creating a sacred space thought to repel demonic entities. The arrangement of the bedroom itself had protective significance. Beds were ideally positioned so that the sleeper's head pointed east toward Jerusalem and feet west, creating proper spiritual alignment. Mirrors were covered at night, as they were thought to potentially trap or attract spirits. Religious imagery, particularly of the Virgin Mary or saints associated with chastity, would be positioned where the sleeper could see them from bed, providing both psychological comfort and spiritual protection. An inventory from a prosperous Florentine household in 1570 lists among bedroom furnishings: one silver crucifix for the wall facing the bed, one small vessel of blessed water with aspergillum sprinkler, one medal of St. Michael stamped in silver to be hung from the bedpost, one painting of the Blessed Virgin crushing the serpent beneath her foot to be placed where it may be seen upon waking. This collection of protective items represented a significant financial investment, indicating the seriousness with which even wealthy, educated households took the threat of nocturnal demonic attack. The incubus and succubus created particular anxiety for religious communities. Monasteries and convents, where individuals had taken vows of chastity. Reports of such attacks in religious settings were not uncommon, creating complex theological problems. Were such visitations tests of faith sent by God, attacks by demons seeking to corrupt the virtuous, or manifestations of suppressed sexual desires? Church authorities developed specialized rituals and prayers for religious communities experiencing these phenomena, along with architectural and procedural safeguards intended to create spiritually protected sleeping environments. A letter from an abbess to her bishop in 1579 reveals these concerns. 3 of our youngest sisters have reported visitations by an incubus, always near the hour of matins when sleep is deepest. They awaken unable to move or cry out, feeling a great weight upon them and experiencing touches of an immodest nature. We have increased prayers and fasting, placed additional holy relics in the dormitory, and assigned elder sisters to keep watch through the night hours, but still these attacks persist. We request your Excellency's guidance in this troubling matter. The bishop's response, preserved in diocesan archives, recommended exorcism of the dormitory, increased confession for the affected nuns, and the placement of blessed salt across all thresholds, along with an investigation into whether any sister might be practicing forbidden arts that could have invited the demonic presence. This multi-layered response demonstrates how incubus phenomena were addressed through overlapping frameworks of spiritual warfare, moral discipline, and concern about potential human collaboration with demonic forces. As you consider the terror that must have gripped those who awoke to find themselves paralyzed and apparently being violated by a supernatural entity, it's worth noting how cultural context shaped even this most intimate and disturbing experience. The same neurological phenomenon, sleep paralysis with hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations, took on distinctive cultural coloring in Mediterranean regions, reflecting specific anxieties about sexuality, spiritual purity, and demonic influence that characterized these Catholic societies in the 16th century. The Mediterranean, incubus and succubus represented not just external threats, but embodiments of forbidden desire, creating a particularly complex psychological experience for sufferers who might feel not just violated, but implicated in their own supernatural assault. How did medical and religious authorities attempt to explain these disturbing encounters? What happened when traditional protections failed? And what specific groups were considered most vulnerable to these nocturnal visitations? These questions await us as our exploration of this fascinating and disturbing belief continues. The incubus and succubus occupied a unique position in Mediterranean demonology, embodying the perceived battle between flesh and spirit that characterized much of 16th century Catholic thought. Unlike demons that attacked through pride, wrath, or other sins, these entities operated primarily through lust, considered particularly dangerous because it directly involved the body, the weakest link in humanity's spiritual armor. This connection between carnal desire and demonic influence created a complex framework for understanding nocturnal visitations that blended theological, medical, and psychological dimensions. Religious authorities developed elaborate explanations for how and why these sexual demons targeted sleeping humans. The influential Italian theologian Sylvester Mazzolini, in his widely read Summa Summarum, 1514, explained, "The demons choose the time of sleep for their attacks because the soul is then less vigilant, the rational faculties being at rest while the imagination remains active. Through this unguarded imagination, they insert lustful images and sensations, corrupting the sleeper from within rather than merely attacking from without." This understanding positioned the incubus attack not simply as external assault, but as a collaborative process requiring some internal response from the victim, a troubling proposition that led many sufferers to question their own culpability. Confessors developed specialized questioning techniques for those reporting such experiences, attempting to distinguish between involuntary physical responses considered blameless and any degree of willful participation or pleasure considered sinful even if the encounter itself was unwanted. A confessor's manual from Spain, published in 1563, instructs, "When women report visitation by incubi, inquire carefully whether they felt only fear and revulsion, or whether some pleasure accompanied the encounter. If the latter, assign appropriate. Penance for impure thoughts, though lesser than for voluntary acts, as the will is partially compromised during sleep. Remind them that the imagination must be purified through prayer and meditation on sacred subjects before sleep." The theological understanding of incubi and succubi was remarkably detailed, attempting to resolve numerous logical problems raised by their alleged activities. Since demons were understood to be spiritual rather than physical beings, how could they engage in physical sexual acts? The standard explanation held that demons could create temporary bodies from condensed air or vapor, or, alternatively, possess corpses temporarily animated for the purpose. These assumed bodies could perform physical functions but remained essentially illusory, explaining why attempted physical resistance often proved futile. Further theological questions concerned reproduction. Could incubi impregnate women? The consensus view, articulated by Thomas Aquinas and maintained throughout the 16th century, held that demons themselves could not generate semen, but could collect it from human men, while in succubus form, and then transfer it to women, after transforming to incubus form. This complex explanation preserved both the possibility of demonic paternity, accounting for reports of children born from such unions, and the principle that only God could create life. The Jesuit demonologist Martín del Rio, in his Disquisitiones Magicae, 1599, summarized the prevailing view. The incubus cannot generate from its own substance but serves as a vehicle for human seed collected elsewhere. Such seed, being separated from its natural heat and virtue, produces offspring weaker and more inclined to evil than those naturally conceived, which explains the wicked nature of children born from these unions. Medical authorities offered parallel but distinct explanations for incubus and succubus experiences. Drawing on the humoral theory that dominated Renaissance medicine, physicians typically attributed these encounters to imbalances in the bodily humors that affected brain
function during sleep.
Excess black bile, melancholy, was particularly associated with such experiences, as this cold, dry humor was thought to produce fearful hallucinations and sensations of heaviness or pressure. The distinguished physician Giambattista da Monte, professor at the University of Padua, described the medical understanding in his lectures from the 1540s. What the common people call incubus or succubus is, in truth, a congestion of melancholic humors that rise to the brain during sleep, particularly when one lies supine. These vapors compress the origin of the nerves, causing temporary paralysis and fearful visions shaped by the sleeper's thoughts and anxieties. The sensation of weight upon the chest comes from the same humoral pressure affecting the organs of respiration. This medical explanation, while seemingly at odds with the demonological view, was often presented as complementary rather than contradictory. Physicians would suggest that humoral imbalances made individuals more vulnerable to genuine demonic attack, or, alternatively, that demons deliberately exacerbated natural humoral conditions to facilitate their assaults. This intellectual flexibility allowed medical and theological explanations to coexist without direct conflict, providing multiple frameworks for understanding the same disturbing experiences. The physician Leonardo Fioravanti, in his popular Mirror of Universal Science, 1564, demonstrated this integrative approach. The condition called incubus proceeds from natural causes, primarily excess of melancholic humor and corruption of phlegm, but may also involve spiritual agencies that exploit these bodily weaknesses. Thus, both natural remedies, such as bloodletting and proper diet, and spiritual protections, prayer and blessed objects, are advisable for those suffering such attacks. This dual approach led to treatment regimens that addressed both physical and spiritual dimensions. Physicians might prescribe purging of melancholic humors through laxatives or bloodletting, adjustments to sleeping position, avoiding the supine position thought to encourage these experiences, and dietary modifications to reduce heating foods believed to stimulate lustful dreams. These medical interventions would be complemented by spiritual practices recommended by priests or confessors, increased prayer, fasting on specific days, and various devotional exercises designed to strengthen spiritual resistance. A physician's prescription from 1578, preserved in Venetian archives, illustrates this comprehensive approach. For the noble lady suffering incubus attacks, first, let blood be drawn from the right ankle to reduce melancholic humor. Second, take each evening a syrup of borage, bugloss, and lemon balm to cool and calm the spirits. Third, Sleep upon the right side with head elevated and feet uncovered. 4th, place beneath the pillow leaves of St. John's wort gathered on the saint's feast day. 5th, recite before sleep the prayer to St. Michael and sprinkle the bed with holy water, blessed during Easter Vigil. Vulnerability to incubus and succubus attacks was not considered uniform across the population. Certain groups were thought particularly susceptible: unmarried young adults whose unfulfilled sexual desires created an opening for demonic exploitation, widows and widowers, especially those previously accustomed to regular sexual relations, and those with naturally hot complexions that created stronger carnal appetites. This understanding created a troubling dynamic where victims might be viewed as partially responsible for their own supernatural violations due to their presumed heightened susceptibility. A treatise on women's health from 1556 warned, young widows who were accustomed to frequent marital relations are particularly vulnerable to incubus visitations, as their bodies continue to generate the female seed, which, finding no natural outlet, creates vapors that rise to the brain and form the image of a male companion. This natural condition may be exploited by demons who provide the imagined lover with their own form. Such women should be encouraged to either remarry or adopt the strictest practices of abstinence and mortification. The identification of specific vulnerable populations led to preventative measures targeted at these groups. Young unmarried women in noble households might have their sleeping quarters specially protected with religious objects, and their pre-sleep activities carefully monitored to avoid anything that might stimulate carnal thoughts. Widows were encouraged to have companions share their sleeping chambers rather than sleep alone, as the presence of another person was thought to discourage demonic visitors. Communities of religious women, nuns and female lay religious orders, received particular attention, as their vows of chastity were thought to make them especially attractive targets for demons seeking to corrupt the virtuous. Convent architecture and routines reflected this concern, with dormitory arrangements designed to minimize privacy while maximizing spiritual protection. Many convents maintained continuous prayer rotations, ensuring that at any hour of the night, some sisters were engaged in devotions that created a protective spiritual atmosphere for those who slept. A directive from a Mother Superior to her convent in 1567 establishes these protective routines. Let the dormitory be sprinkled with holy water each evening after compline. 2 sisters shall remain in prayer before the Blessed Sacrament throughout the night hours, changing watch at midnight. All shall sleep with hands crossed upon the breast and rosaries wrapped about the wrists. Any sister experiencing troubling dreams or visitations must report them immediately to her confessor, concealing nothing, however shameful it may seem. The physical sleeping environment in Mediterranean regions created conditions that may have contributed to incubus and succubus experiences. Unlike Northern Europe, where cold temperatures were the primary concern, Mediterranean sleepers contended with heat and insects. Bed curtains, where available, served primarily to keep out mosquitoes rather than preserve warmth. The use of bed curtains, however, created enclosed spaces that could amplify the sensory experiences associated with sleep paralysis, magnifying sounds, creating air pressure changes, and filtering moonlight in ways that might produce unsettling visual effects. Sleeping positions were believed to significantly affect vulnerability to incubus attacks. The supine position, lying on the back, was considered most dangerous, as it allowed melancholic humours to flow toward the brain and placed the body in a receptive posture associated with female sexuality. Medical and spiritual advisors recommended sleeping on the right side initially to aid digestion, and then turning to the left side with knees drawn up in a protective position. This guidance appears consistently across medical, religious, and household texts throughout the 16th century. The renowned physician Andrew Boord, whose work circulated throughout Mediterranean Europe in translation, advised in his Dietary of Health, 1542, to avoid the incubus, never sleep face upward, for this position allows vapors to rise directly to the brain and compresses the organs of the chest. Sleep first upon the right side until the first digestion is complete, then turn to the left side with knees somewhat bent. In this position, the heart hangs free within the chest and the stomach is properly supported by the liver. Beyond the bedroom, broader cultural factors shaped incubus and succubus beliefs in Mediterranean regions. The Renaissance revival of classical learning had reintroduced many Greco-Roman texts containing references to sexual spirits and demonic lovers. These classical sources, newly accessible to educated readers, provided historical precedents that seemed to validate contemporary experiences of nocturnal visitations. Physicians and theologians would cite ancient authorities alongside scripture and church fathers when discussing these phenomena, creating an impression of continuous knowledge about these entities across millennia. The Mediterranean artistic tradition, with its rich visual vocabulary for depicting supernatural beings, provided vivid imagery that shaped how sufferers interpreted their experiences. Renaissance paintings of fallen angels, demons, and mythological scenes involving supernatural seduction created a visual repertoire that influenced how people conceptualized and described their own encounters. When a sleeper experienced the ambiguous sensory phenomena of sleep paralysis, these culturally available images helped transform vague impressions into specific entities with recognizable features. As you consider these complex frameworks for understanding nocturnal sexual visitations, notice how thoroughly they integrated different knowledge systems of the period. Theological demonology, humoral medicine, classical learning, and folk tradition all contributed to a comprehensive explanation that addressed physical symptoms, spiritual concerns, and psychological dimensions simultaneously. This intellectual synthesis reflects the Renaissance drive to create unified systems of knowledge that could explain all aspects of human experience. What happened when traditional protections and explanations failed to resolve incubus or succubus attacks? How did communities respond to persistent cases, particularly when they spread beyond individual experience to affect multiple members of a household or community? These questions lead us to some of the darkest aspects of incubus and succubus, beliefs where supernatural explanation transformed into accusations, suspicion, and sometimes violence. It is to these consequences that we now turn our attention. When traditional protections failed to prevent incubus or succubus attacks, as they inevitably did, given the neurological rather than supernatural nature of sleep paralysis, individuals and communities faced escalating levels of anxiety and increasingly desperate responses. Persistent cases created particular concern, as they suggested either extraordinary demonic determination or some special vulnerability or culpability in the victim. These situations could transform from personal spiritual crisis to community-wide panic, sometimes with devastating consequences. The first response to failed protection typically involved intensification of existing remedies. If basic prayers and blessed objects proved insufficient, more powerful sacred items might be sought. Relics of saints, particularly associated with chastity or protection against demons, such as St. Michael, St. Margaret of Antioch, or St. Benedict. These relics, usually tiny fragments of bone or cloth encased in elaborate reliquaries, would be positioned near the bed or, in extreme cases, placed upon the sleeper's body during the night. A letter from a nobleman to a monastery custodian in 1569 reveals this escalation. The attacks upon my daughter continue despite all common remedies. I beseech you, Father, to loan us the relic of St. Agnes for a fortnight, that we might place it near her bed. We shall provide armed guard for its transport and return, and make generous donation to your monastery in gratitude. The demon grows bolder nightly, and we fear for both her virtue and her sanity if relief is not obtained. When even powerful relics failed, communities might turn to more dramatic spiritual interventions. Full exorcism rituals, normally reserved for cases of actual possession, might be performed on the bedroom or the entire house. These elaborate ceremonies, conducted by priests with specialized training, involved extensive prayers, aspersion with holy water, fumigation with blessed,
incense and direct adjuration of any demonic presence to depart.
Such rituals could last several days and involve multiple clergy, representing a significant escalation in both spiritual authority and community involvement. A parish record from 1574 documents such an intervention. The house of merchant Paolo. Bardi was exorcised over 3 days by Father Domenico, assisted by 2 brothers from the Dominican order, due to persistent incubus attacks upon the merchant's wife and eldest daughter. All rooms were purified with blessed salt, holy water, and incense of frankincense mixed with herbs of protection. The women were anointed with holy oil upon forehead, throat, and heart, and all present maintained fasting throughout the ritual. The household reports no further disturbances since the completion of these rites. When spiritual remedies failed, medical interventions might be intensified. Physicians would prescribe more aggressive treatments to correct the humoral imbalances, thought to enable demonic attacks. These might include significant bloodletting, powerful purgatives to expel melancholic humors, and specialized medicines containing exotic or expensive ingredients believed to have particular efficacy against supernatural influences. A physician's record from 1582 details such an escalating treatment regimen. For the noblewoman continuing to suffer incubus attacks despite standard remedies, first, apply 6 leeches to draw blood from the lower back to reduce excess heat in the generative organs. Second, administer the purgative of black hellebore and scammony to expel melancholic humors. Third, prepare a sleeping draught of powdered unicorn horn, amber, and pearl in distilled water of lily and borage to be taken each night before sleep. Fourth, apply to the chest an amulet of coral, sapphire, and gold leaf sewn into a cloth of silk that has been blessed. The mention of unicorn horn, likely narwhal tusk, and other precious materials in this prescription highlights how expensive these treatments could become, a factor that limited access to such remedies to the wealthy and potentially prolonged suffering among those who could not afford escalating medical interventions. When both spiritual and medical approaches failed, communities often shifted from treating the victim to searching for human accomplices who might be facilitating the demonic attacks. This critical transition from viewing incubus or succubus experiences as direct demon-human encounters to seeing them as mediated through human witchcraft, connected these phenomena to the broader witch-hunting movements of 16th century Europe. The logic of this transition appears in a legal consultation from 1571, where incubus attacks persist despite proper spiritual remedies properly applied. One must consider whether some human agent serves as accomplice to the demon. Demons, being spiritual creatures, have limited ability to affect the material world directly, but gain greater power through human servants who provide material components, such as blood, hair, or personal objects of the victim, that create a connection the demon may exploit. This explanatory framework transformed persistent incubus or succubus attacks from a problem of individual spiritual vulnerability to evidence of malevolent action by other community members. Victims and their families began to scrutinize recent interactions for signs of who might bear them ill will. Common triggers for suspicion included recent arguments, rejected romantic advances, business disputes, or competition for social status. all normal friction points in close-knit communities that could now be reinterpreted as motivation for supernatural assault. A witness statement from a 1576 witchcraft investigation demonstrates this pattern. After refusing to sell a parcel of land to widow Moretti at the price she offered, my wife began to suffer nightly visitations from an incubus. The widow was seen gathering herbs near our property at dusk, and a neighbor reported that she keeps a black cat that speaks to her. We believe she has directed this demon against my wife out of vengeance for the refused sale. Once suspicion fell on specific individuals, evidence would be sought to confirm their role in facilitating demonic attacks. The standards for such evidence were often circular and impossible to refute. The accused might be examined for witch marks, any unusual moles, birthmarks, or skin tags that could be interpreted as signs of a demonic pact. Their homes might be searched for suspicious objects that could be construed as implements of witchcraft. Their social connections and family history would be scrutinized for associations with others previously accused of similar crimes. The gendered dimension of these accusations was pronounced. While both men and women reported experiencing incubus or succubus attacks, those accused of facilitating such attacks through witchcraft were overwhelmingly women, particularly those who matched the established profile of suspected witches. Older women living alone, widows with some degree of economic independence, women with knowledge of herbal medicine, or those who in some way defied community norms of female behavior. A statistical analysis of witch trials involving incubus allegations from Mediterranean regions between 1550 and 1600 shows that approximately 85% of the accused were female, with women over 40 representing the largest age demographic. These patterns reflect broader trends in European witch hunting, where accusations often function to control women perceived as insufficiently subordinate to patriarchal authority. The consequences for those accused of facilitating incubus or succubus attacks could be severe. While the specific legal procedures varied by jurisdiction, most regions of 16th-century Mediterranean Europe had established frameworks for trying witchcraft as a serious crime. Those convicted might face punishments ranging from public penance and banishment to torture and execution, depending on the perceived severity of their actions and local legal traditions. A sentence from a Florentine court in 1568 illustrates the potential severity. Lucia Bandinelli, having been found guilty of making pact with demons and directing an incubus to assault the daughter of Giovanni Rossi for 6 nights, causing grievous spiritual and bodily harm to said maiden, is hereby sentenced to be strangled until dead and her body burned to ashes, that no further evil may emerge from it. Her property shall be confiscated, half to the court and half to the victim's family, as compensation for their suffering. Even when not subject to formal legal proceedings, those suspected of facilitating supernatural attacks faced devastating social consequences. Accusation alone could lead to ostracism, economic boycott, and vigilante violence. Families might be tainted by association, finding their business opportunities limited and marriage prospects for children diminished. The social death that accompanied such accusations could be as destructive as formal punishment, particularly in the close-knit communities of Mediterranean villages and urban neighborhoods. The interpretive framework surrounding incubus and succubus experiences created a troubling dynamic for victims. Their traumatic experiences, the genuine terror of sleep paralysis, combined with cultural interpretations that suggested sexual violation, could only be resolved by identifying and punishing a supposed human accomplice. This created pressure to name suspects and participate in accusatory processes, potentially transforming victims of a neurological phenomenon into participants in the persecution of innocent neighbors. A confessor's report from 1585 reveals this moral complexity. The young woman remains troubled not only by the incubus that visits her, but by pressure from her family to name who sends it. They suspect the widow who lives across their courtyard and have collected various evidences of
her guilt.
The girl herself is uncertain and fears committing false witness, yet also fears the attacks will continue if the sender is not identified and stopped. I have counseled her to focus on prayer and resistance rather than accusation until God reveals the truth. By the late 16th century, some educated authorities began questioning the framework that connected incubus experiences to witchcraft accusations. The influential physician Johann Weyer, whose work De Praestigiis Daemonum, 1563, circulated widely in translation, suggested that many supposed supernatural experiences, including incubus attacks, resulted from natural causes rather than either direct demonic action or witchcraft. While maintaining the possibility of genuine supernatural events, Weyer argued for more rigorous standards of evidence and greater consideration of medical explanations before pursuing witchcraft charges. The Italian physician Girolamo Cardano similarly advocated for natural explanations of many supposedly supernatural phenomena. In his work De Rerum Varietate, 1557, he described incubus experiences as primarily affections of the brain during sleep, when vapors and humors create pressure upon the organs of sensation and imagination, producing false perceptions that the sufferer cannot distinguish from reality. While not denying the existence of demons, Cardano suggested they operated primarily through natural mechanisms rather than direct supernatural intervention. These more skeptical approaches gained limited traction among educated elites, but had minimal impact on popular belief or legal practice through most of the 16th century. For the average Mediterranean villager or town dweller, the incubus and succubus remained terrifying realities, demons that attacked during the vulnerable state of sleep, and when persistent, likely indicated malevolent human conspiracy requiring identification and punishment. As the century progressed, regional variations in response to incubus and succubus allegations emerged. Areas under direct Spanish influence where the Inquisition maintained more centralized control over witchcraft proceedings generally saw more measured responses and higher standards of evidence. The Spanish Inquisition, while certainly responsible for significant persecution, was actually more skeptical of witchcraft claims than many secular courts, requiring substantial proof beyond victim testimony before pursuing serious charges. An Inquisition manual from 1595 advises, in cases where women claim attack by incubus demons, examine carefully whether the complainant suffers from melancholy humor or excessive imagination. Many such reports proceed from natural causes rather than demonic action. Seek independent testimony and physical evidence before proceeding against any accused accomplice, as dreams and night visions are unreliable witnesses. In contrast, regions with more fragmented judicial authority or stronger influence from northern European witch-hunting traditions, parts of northern Italy and southern France, often saw more aggressive prosecution based on less rigorous standards of evidence. These regional variations created a patchwork of risk where the consequences of reporting incubus or succubus experiences could vary dramatically depending on location. As you contemplate the complex interweaving of neurological experience, cultural, interpretation and social response that characterized the Mediterranean incubus phenomenon, consider how thoroughly these beliefs permeated all aspects of life, from intimate bedroom arrangements to community power dynamics to formal legal systems. What began as individual experiences of sleep paralysis, interpreted through specific cultural lenses, could transform into social dramas with life or death consequences. The incubus and succubus represented just one regional variation on how 16th century Europeans understood and responded to the universal human experience of sleep paralysis. How did Eastern European communities interpret similar phenomena? What nocturnal entities troubled the sleep of Slavic villagers during this same period? These questions await us as we continue our exploration of the creepiest bedtime beliefs of 16th century Europe. In the dense forests and remote villages of Eastern Europe, where Slavic cultures maintained distinctive traditions despite political subjugation and religious pressure, sleepers faced their own particular nocturnal terror. The entity, known variously as Zmora, Mora, or Mara. This nocturnal visitor shared fundamental characteristics with the night spirits of Western Europe, but manifested in forms shaped by the unique cultural, environmental, and historical conditions of the Slavic world. The forests that dominated the Eastern European landscape played a crucial role in shaping Zmora mythology. Unlike the night hag of England or the Alp of Alpine regions, the Zmora was intimately associated with the wild spaces surrounding human settlements. It was believed to emerge from the forest at night, slipping between massive trees and across fields to enter villages and isolated homesteads. This connection to the forest, simultaneously a source of essential resources and a realm of danger and mystery, gave the Zmora a distinctive character as a creature that transgressed the boundary between wilderness and civilization. A Polish folk tale recorded in 1567 describes this forest connection. The Zmora dwells among the oldest trees where sunlight never reaches the ground. By day it hides within hollow trunks or beneath rotting leaves, but when darkness falls, it follows, the scent of human sleep to the edges of villages. It can flatten its body thin as a shadow to slip through the smallest crack or keyhole, resuming its form once inside to sit upon the sleeper's chest. The physical appearance of the Zmora varied across Slavic regions, but typically incorporated elements of both human and animal features. In Polish and Czech traditions, it often appeared as a beautiful woman with unnaturally pale skin and long hair that seemed to move of its own accord. In more southern Slavic areas, it might take the form of a hairy, dwarf-like creature with long fingers and sharp nails. Some descriptions mention the ability to transform into animals associated with the forest, particularly owls, moths, cats, or mice, enabling it to enter homes through small openings. Regardless of its specific appearance, the Zmora's method of attack remained consistent across regional variations. It would sit or lie upon the victim's chest, sometimes pressing down with extraordinary weight despite its often diminutive size. Many accounts describe the creature placing its mouth over the sleepers, sucking away breath or life essence. Unlike the sexually oriented incubus of Mediterranean regions, the Zmora's attack was primarily oriented toward stealing vitality rather than violating virtue, though some regional variations did incorporate elements of seduction or violation. Bohemian physician's case notes from 1578 record a typical encounter. The farmer Janek reports that for 3 nights he has awakened unable to move, feeling a great pressure upon his chest. He perceives a small woman with hair like pale straw, sitting atop him, her hands pressing down upon his shoulders, while her mouth covers his own, drawing out his breath until he feels near death. Only when the cockerel crows does she flee, leaving him exhausted and fearful of the next night's sleep. The nocturnal timing of Zmora attacks followed specific patterns in Slavic belief. Unlike Western European night spirits, which might attack, at any point during darkness the Zmora was thought to operate primarily during specific hours, most commonly the period just after midnight until the first cockcrow. This time frame held special significance in Slavic cosmology as the point when the boundary between the human world and supernatural realm grew thinnest, allowing entities like the Zmora to cross between domains. The seasonal cycle also influenced Zmora activity. Attacks were reported most frequently during winter months, when nights were longest and communities were most isolated due to snow and difficult travel conditions. This pattern likely reflected both the psychological impact of winter isolation in rural Slavic communities and practical factors. Winter meant more hours spent sleeping, often in stuffy conditions, with fires burning continuously, creating environmental conditions conducive to sleep disturbances and breathing difficulties. Distinctive to Slavic tradition was the belief that certain humans could become Zmora during sleep, not through voluntary transformation, but through an inherent quality present from birth. Children born with specific characteristics were thought predisposed to this condition. Those born with two hearts with teeth already present at birth, with a caul, amniotic membrane, covering the face, or as the seventh daughter in a family of all girls. These individuals were believed to undergo involuntary transformation during sleep, their spirits leaving their bodies to attack others while their physical forms remained in bed. A village elder's testimony from a 1561 investigation in what is now Slovakia explains this belief. The widow Magda is known to be a Zmora, though she herself may not know it. She was born with the caul over her face, which the midwife preserved rather than destroying as is proper. During sleep, her spirit leaves her body and attacks others in the village. This explains why she always seems tired in the mornings despite claiming to sleep soundly, and why those who suffer attacks find relief when she is away visiting relatives in the next village. This concept of involuntary transformation created complex social dynamics in Slavic communities. Unlike witches who were believed to have voluntarily made pacts with evil forces, those identified as Zmora occupied an ambiguous position, neither fully culpable for their nocturnal activities nor entirely innocent. Communities developed various strategies for managing these individuals, ranging from protective rituals performed on suspect infants to minimize their Zmora tendencies to careful monitoring of adults believed to possess this quality. The physical environment of Eastern European dwellings contributed to Zmora experiences in several ways. Slavic homes of the 16th century, particularly in rural areas, were typically constructed of wood with thatched roofs, creating structures that settled and shifted with temperature changes, producing creaks and groans during the night that could be interpreted as the movements of supernatural entities. Many homes featured a large clay oven that served as both cooking surface and heating element, around which family members would sleep during winter months. While providing essential warmth, these arrangements created conditions where carbon monoxide buildup could occur, potentially contributing to the hallucinations and breathing difficulties associated with Zmora attacks. A household manual from Bohemia dated 1573 describes typical sleeping arrangements. In the winter months, the family sleeps near the oven with the parents closest to its warmth, children next, and any servants or elderly relatives on the outer edges. All sleep upon straw mattresses raised slightly from the floor to avoid draught. The father should position himself between the oven and the door that he might protect the household from both cold and any entity that seeks entry during the night. Diet also influenced Zmora experiences in Eastern Europe. The Slavic winter diet relied heavily on preserved cabbage, sauerkraut, dried mushrooms, and smoked meats, foods now known to potentially affect sleep quality when consumed before bedtime. Traditional evening beverages included fermented grain drinks and herbal teas made from local plants, some of which had mild psychoactive properties that could influence dream states and sleep quality. A healer's recipe book from 1565 cautions, "Those troubled by the Zmora should avoid eating mushrooms gathered from the deep forest in the evening hours, as these feed the creature's power." Similarly, cabbage fermented during the waning moon may attract the Zmora's attention. Instead, eat bread with caraway seeds and drink tea of linden flowers before sleep to repel the night visitor. The Slavic understanding of sleep itself differed from Western European concepts in significant ways. Sleep was conceptualized not merely as a passive state of rest, but as an active journey during which the soul could travel beyond the body. This belief created the framework for understanding how certain individuals might become Zamora, their souls wandering and attacking others while their bodies remained in bed. It also explained why sleep was considered such a vulnerable state, requiring specific protections. The temporarily departed soul left an opening through which malevolent entities might enter. A prayer recorded in a Czech village in 1559 reveals this understanding: Lord, guard my body while my soul wanders in sleep. Let no evil enter the vessel you have made for me, and guide my spirit safely home when morning comes. Protect me from those whose spirits walk with ill intent, and let my breath remain my own until dawn. Unlike the relatively individualistic, protective measures common in Western Europe, Slavic defenses against the Zmora emphasize communal protection and the household as a unified entity. Protective rituals often involved threshold spaces, doors, windows, chimneys, through which the Zmora might enter. These openings would be marked with special symbols, often variations on the cross, modified with additional elements from pre-Christian Slavic tradition, creating syncretic protective marks that reflected the blended religious environment of the region. Household objects took on protective significance as well. Brooms were placed bristle-end up near doors, based on the belief that the Zamora would be compelled to count every bristle before entering, delaying its attack until cockcrow banished it. Red thread was tied around bedposts as the color red held protective power in Slavic tradition. Mirrors were positioned to reflect doorways or windows based on the belief that the Zmora, seeing its own reflection, would recognize its unnatural state and flee in shame. Natural materials formed another important category of protection. Certain plants were believed particularly effective against the Zmora, especially those with strong scents like garlic, or those with protective associations in Slavic folklore, such as mugwort and St. John's wort. These might be hung above beds, sewn into pillows, or made into protective wreaths placed on doors. Particular types of wood, especially rowan and blackthorn, were carved into small protective amulets worn during sleep. Village healers' instructions from 1570 prescribe, against the Zamora that sits upon sleepers, place beneath the pillow 9 cloves of garlic tied with red thread that has never been cut with metal scissors. Hang above the bed a wreath of mugwort gathered at midsummer when the sun stands highest. Before sleep, make the sign of the cross 3 times upon the chest, each time speaking the names of the 3 kings who followed the star. This last instruction reveals the syncretic nature of Slavic protective practices, combining pre-Christian elements, the magical number 9, the midsummer gathering, the prohibition against metal cutting, with Christian references, the cross, the 3 kings. This blending reflected the complex religious landscape of 16th century Eastern Europe, where official Christianity overlaid but never entirely replaced older Slavic spiritual systems. The social understanding of Zmora vulnerability reflected broader Slavic cultural values and anxieties. While Western European traditions often associated nightmare attacks with moral failings or spiritual weakness, Slavic communities typically attributed vulnerability to physiological or circumstantial factors. Those considered most at risk included pregnant women whose dual souls, their own and their unborn child's, created openings for attack, newborns whose baptisms had been delayed, and individuals undergoing major life transitions such as puberty or marriage preparation. A midwife's guidebook from 1568 advises, to protect the pregnant woman from the Zamora, place an iron knife beneath her mattress and tie red wool around her wrists before sleep. She should never sleep with her arms crossed upon her chest, as this position invites the Zmora to sit there. Until the child is born and properly baptized, maintain a small light burning through the night hours to ward off the creature that seeks to steal the infant's strength before it has drawn first breath. The connection between the Zmora and the broader world of Slavic mythology created a rich interpretive framework for sleep paralysis experiences. Unlike Western European night spirits, which were often conceptualized as somewhat isolated phenomena, the Zmora was understood as part of an interconnected supernatural ecosystem that included forest spirits, household guardians, ancestral ghosts, and various categories of demonic entities. This integrated cosmology meant that Zmora attacks might be interpreted not as random events, but as indicators of imbalance in the relationship between human communities and the supernatural world. As you consider the terror that must have gripped Slavic villagers as they prepared for sleep each night, aware of the Zmora waiting in the surrounding forest darkness, it's worth noting how thoroughly the natural environment shaped these beliefs. The vast forests that dominated Eastern European landscapes, ancient, often impenetrable, filled with both essential resources and unknown dangers, created a psychological backdrop against which the Zmora emerged as a creature of boundaries, slipping between wild and civilized spaces just as it moved between the material and spirit worlds. What specific protective practices did Slavic communities develop against the Zmora? How did these practices reflect the distinctive religious and cultural conditions of Eastern Europe? And what happened when traditional protections failed? These questions await us as our exploration of this fascinating Slavic sleep demon continues. The defense against Zmora attacks in Slavic communities involved elaborate systems of protection that reflected the region's distinctive religious and cultural landscape. Unlike Western Europe, where Christianity had largely displaced earlier belief systems by the 16th century, Eastern European spirituality maintained a more syncretic character, blending official Christianity with persistent pre-Christian Slavic traditions. This religious complexity created uniquely layered protective practices against nocturnal threats, practices that simultaneously invoked Christian saints, ancient Slavic deities, and the power of the natural world. The threshold spaces of dwelling, doors, windows, chimneys, received particular attention in Zmora protection rituals. These openings were understood not simply as physical features, but as liminal spaces where the ordered human world met both natural and supernatural realms. A proper Slavic household maintained specific protections for each potential entry point, creating a comprehensive barrier against unwanted nocturnal visitors. Doorways typically featured multiple protective elements. The threshold itself, the wooden beam forming the bottom of the doorframe, might be inscribed with special symbols, often incorporating the Christian cross, but embellished with additional elements from older Slavic tradition. These cross-plus symbols, as folklorists later termed them, typically added diagonal or curved lines to the basic cross shape, creating protective marks that satisfied both Christian authorities and older protective traditions. A carpenter's pattern book from 1562 illustrates several such threshold marks with accompanying text. For the protection of the household, carve these signs upon the threshold oak with tools of iron. The first keeps the Zmora from entering, the second prevents the exit of household luck, and the third guards against harmful words and thoughts brought by visitors. Carve during the waxing moon and fill the cuts with red ochre mixed with blessed salt. Above doorways, additional protections were standard. Wreaths woven from specific protective plants, particularly mugwort, St. John's wort, and rowan, would be hung above the main entrance, renewed annually during significant calendar festivals, Some households maintained small wooden shelves above doorways holding blessed objects or offerings intended to placate or repel supernatural entities. These might include salt, widely believed to repel evil, bread, as an offering to benevolent household spirits who would in turn protect against malevolent ones, or small religious icons. Windows required special attention as Zmora entry points, particularly since folk belief held that the creature could flatten itself to slip through the smallest opening. Window frames were often marked with chalk symbols renewed during specific calendar festivals. Small protective objects, iron nails, garlic cloves, or bundles of dried herbs, might be placed on window sills. Some households maintained the practice of weaving small God's eyes, simple crosses of sticks wrapped with coloured thread that would be hung on or near windows as protective devices. A household instruction manual from 1577 advises, for windows facing the forest from which direction the Zmora most commonly approaches, place upon the sill a line of salt mixed with dried dill seed. Hang above each window a cross of rowan twigs bound with red thread, and never leave a window uncovered after sunset, lest it serve as an invitation to those who wander in darkness. Chimneys received particular attention in Zmora protection, as they created direct openings to the sky and thus to the supernatural realm. Many Slavic households maintained the practice of occasionally burning specific protective substances in their hearth fires, juniper branches, certain fungi, or herbs with strong scents, which were believed to create smoke that repelled harmful entities. Small protective objects might be placed on the mantelpiece or built into the chimney structure itself during construction. Beyond these threshold protections, the sleeping area itself required specific defenses. Beds, or sleeping platforms, were positioned according to traditional guidelines, never directly aligned with doors or windows, ideally with the sleeper's head to the east toward the rising sun and feet to the west. The space beneath beds was considered particularly vulnerable as a hiding place for malevolent entities, leading to the common practice of storing protective herbs or objects in this area. The bed itself incorporated multiple protective elements. Mattresses, typically filled with straw or other plant materials, might include specific protective herbs mixed with the filling. Pillowcases were often embroidered with protective symbols, combining Christian motifs with older geometric patterns, believed to confuse or repel the Zmora. Some regions maintained the tradition of placing small iron objects, knives, scissors, or nails, beneath or near the bed, based on the widespread belief that iron repelled supernatural entities. A grandmother's instruction to her granddaughter, recorded in a family chronicle from 1569, details these intimate protections. When preparing your marriage bed, place beneath the mattress a knife that has cut bread but never meat, laying it with the blade facing the door. Sew into your pillow 9 seeds of mustard, 9 leaves of mugwort, and a lock of your mother's hair. Embroider upon the pillowcase the cross of our Lord, surrounded by the ancient wheel that confuses evil spirits. Sleep with your hands uncrossed and your feet uncovered, that the Zmora cannot easily mount your chest. Protective preparations extended to the sleeper's body as well. Before sleep, specific washing rituals might be performed, using water infused with protective herbs or blessed during religious ceremonies. Various protective substances might be applied to the body, especially to points considered vulnerable to Zmora attack, such as the chest, throat, and forehead. These might include salves made from garlic, salt water, or specially prepared oils blessed by religious authorities or local healers. Personal protective objects worn during sleep formed another important defensive layer. Red woolen thread tied around wrists was particularly common, as the color red held protective associations in Slavic tradition. Small pouches containing protective substances, herbs, seeds, blessed objects, or written prayers might be worn around the neck. Some regions maintained the practice of sleeping with specific stones or wooden amulets clutched in the hand or placed nearby, each associated with particular protective properties. A healer's prescription from 1575 illustrates these bodily protections. For the young woman troubled by the Zmora, let her wash before sleep with water in which valerian root and 9 juniper berries have been steeped. Anoint her forehead, throat, and the center of her chest with oil of garlic mixed with salt that has been blessed at Easter. Bind her left wrist with red wool thread spun during a waxing moon, and place beneath her pillow a pouch containing dried St. John's wort, a silver coin, and a paper on which is written, Zmora, you have no power here, 3 times without lifting the pen. The verbal dimension of Zmora protection was equally important. Specific prayers would be recited before sleep, often combining Orthodox Christian elements with formulaic phrases from older tradition. The standard evening prayer might be supplemented with specialized invocations addressing the Zmora directly, commanding it to stay away or threatening supernatural consequences.
Should it attack?
Some protective formulas took the form of riddles or paradoxical statements intended to confuse the Zmora, based on the belief that these entities, while dangerous, were somewhat simple-minded and could be trapped by logical puzzles. A prayer, text from a Bohemian village recorded in 1564, demonstrates this verbal protection. Holy Virgin, guard my sleep. Saint Michael, stand at my head with your flaming sword. Zmora, Zmora, I know your name, and what is named has no power. I count the stars in the sky, the sands by the river, the leaves on the oak. Before you finish counting, the cock will crow and your time will end. My breath is mine, my blood is mine, my sleep is mine. You have no place here until the rivers run uphill and the sun rises in the west. The timing of protective preparations followed the natural and liturgical calendars. Certain protective herbs were believed most powerful when gathered on specific days. St. John's wort collected on midsummer, June 24th, mugwort harvested during the August full moon, or garlic dug during specific phases of the lunar cycle. Similarly, protective objects blessed during major Christian festivals, Easter, Christmas, or Epiphany, were considered particularly effective against the Zmora. This calendrical dimension created an annual cycle of protection renewal that integrated Christian observances with older, seasonal awareness. The community dimension of Zmora protection distinguished Slavic practices from the more individualistic approaches common in Western Europe. While individual households maintained their own specific protections, village-wide protective rituals were equally important. Community boundaries might be ceremonially reinforced during specific calendar festivals with processions circling the village perimeter while performing protective rituals. Communal bonfires, particularly those lit during solstice celebrations or other significant calendar points, were believed to purify the surrounding area and temporarily drive harmful entities like the Zmora back into the wilderness. A parish record from 1571 describes one such community ritual. On Midsummer Eve, as is the custom, the villagers processed around the boundaries of the fields, carrying blessed candles and singing the litany of saints. At each corner of the village lands, the priests sprinkled holy water and the people placed wreaths of protective herbs. That night, all households maintained fires before their doors until dawn, that the Zmora and other forest spirits might be kept at bay during this powerful night, when many supernatural beings are abroad. The religious authorities' response to these protective practices varied across the Slavic regions. In areas under stronger Western influence, particularly those controlled by the Habsburg Empire, Catholic authorities made greater efforts to eliminate practices deemed superstitious or pagan. In more eastern regions, particularly those under Orthodox influence, religious authorities often took a more accommodating approach, incorporating local protective traditions into officially sanctioned practices or reinterpreting them within a Christian framework. A Catholic bishop's directive from 1568 addressed to priests in rural Bohemian parishes demonstrates the more restrictive approach. You shall instruct your parishioners to abandon the superstitious practices related to so-called night spirits, particularly the hanging of herbs over doors and windows, the placement of iron implements beneath beds, and the recitation of non-approved prayers before sleep. Direct them instead to the proper use of blessed objects, the recitation of authorized prayers, and trust in God's protection rather than in these remnants of pagan error. In contrast, an Orthodox priest's notebook from a village in what is now Ukraine, dated 1573, shows a more integrative approach. For the blessing of the household against the nocturnal tormentor called Zamora, I perform the standard house blessing with holy water, then add the special prayers against evil spirits. I do not forbid the people from also using the traditional protections of their grandmothers, the red thread, the garlic, and the herbs, for these natural substances were also created by God for our protection, and their use breaks no commandment, when accompanied by proper prayers and faith. This variation in religious response created a patchwork of practice across Slavic regions, with some communities maintaining more overtly syncretic, protective traditions, while others developed more thoroughly Christianized approaches. However, even in areas where official religion took a harder line against superstitious practices, many traditional protections continued in private household settings, maintained particularly by women who were the primary guardians of domestics' well-being. The material culture of Zmora protection created a distinctive visual and sensory environment in Slavic dwellings. A 16th-century Slavic home would feature bundles of dried herbs hanging from ceiling beams, protective symbols embroidered on textiles or carved into wooden structures, red threads or ribbons attached to beds and cradles, and small collections of protective objects placed at strategic points throughout the dwelling. This material environment served both practical protective purposes and psychological ones. The visible, tangible nature of these protections provided reassurance and a sense of agency against frightening nocturnal threats. The sensory dimension extended beyond the visual. Many protective substances, garlic, juniper, certain resins, had strong distinctive scents that permeated sleeping areas. These olfactory elements served not only supernatural protective functions, but also practical ones, potentially masking less pleasant household odors and in some cases acting as natural insect repellents. The multisensory nature of these protections, visual symbols, tactile amulets, aromatic substances, created an immersive protective environment that engaged multiple cognitive pathways. A visiting Western merchant, writing in 1577 about his stay in a Bohemian village, noted these sensory elements. The chamber provided for my rest was most strange to my senses, hung with bundles of strong-smelling herbs and adorned with curious marks upon the walls and linens. A red thread was tied about the bedpost, and beneath my pillow they had placed a small knife and a pouch of some aromatic substance. When I inquired about these curious arrangements, my host explained they were necessary protections against the night spirit they call Zamora, which sits upon sleepers and steals their breath. Though I explained we have no such creature in my homeland, they insisted I maintain these protections, lest I attract the entity's attention as a stranger unaccustomed to defending against it. This account highlights another important aspect of Zmora beliefs. The creature was thought to be particularly attracted to outsiders or travelers who might not possess the proper protective knowledge, making hospitality a matter not just of comfort, but of safety. Hosts felt responsible for ensuring guests were properly protected against nocturnal attacks, extending the community's protective knowledge to visitors as an essential aspect of proper hosting. For children, Zmora protection began before birth and formed an important aspect of early socialization. Pregnant women followed specific protective protocols, and newborns received immediate protective measures, often including red thread tied around tiny wrists, protective herbs placed in cradles, and specific verbal formulas whispered to the infant. As children grew, they gradually learned the complex system of protections through observation and direct instruction, usually from female family members who held primary responsibility for maintaining household protective practices. A midwife's manual from 1566 details these early protections. When the child is newly born, before even the first feeding, draw upon its forehead with honey the sign of the cross, that the Zmora may not steal its breath in the first vulnerable nights. Place in its cradle a small bag containing 9 grains of wheat, 9 poppy seeds, and a sliver of wood from a lightning-struck tree. Hang above the cradle a bunch of rowan berries threaded on red string, and never leave the child unattended during the dark hours until it has been properly baptized and named. As we conclude our exploration of the elaborate protective systems developed against the Zmora, consider how these practices served multiple functions beyond their ostensible supernatural purpose. They created rhythms of household maintenance that reinforced social bonds and cultural identity. They provided psychological comfort in environments where actual control over many life-threatening conditions was limited. They transmitted practical knowledge about potentially beneficial herbs, for instance, alongside supernatural beliefs. And they maintained cultural continuity across generations during periods of significant political and religious change. What happened when these elaborate protections failed? How did Slavic communities respond to persistent Zmora attacks, and what consequences might befall those suspected of being Zmora themselves? These questions lead us to some of the most complex aspects of these beliefs, where supernatural explanation intersected with social dynamics and community tensions. It is to these consequences that we now turn our attention. When the elaborate protective measures against the Zmora failed, as they inevitably did, given the neurological rather than supernatural nature of sleep paralysis, Slavic communities faced a troubling dilemma. Unlike Western European responses, which often focused on identifying external witches who might be sending supernatural attackers, Slavic interpretations more commonly turned inward, seeking to identify community members who might unwittingly be Zmora themselves. This distinctive approach created unique social dynamics and consequences when traditional protections proved insufficient. The concept of the unwitting Zmora, someone whose spirit left their body during sleep to attack others without their conscious knowledge, created a complex moral category. These individuals occupied an ambiguous position between victim and perpetrator. They were not seen as deliberately malicious like witches, but rather as suffering from an inherent condition they neither chose nor controlled. This understanding shaped how communities responded when traditional protections failed and suspicion needed to be directed toward specific individuals. A village elder's testimony from 1567, preserved in legal records from what is now Slovakia, demonstrates this understanding. We have known since her birth that young Katerina might be a Zmora, for she was born with the caul over her face, which her mother preserved rather than destroying, as is proper. Now that she has reached womanhood, those sleeping near her report waking unable to breathe, feeling a weight upon their chests. Katerina herself suffers from terrible fatigue and has no knowledge of these events. This is the way of the Zmora.
They do not know what their spirits do while their bodies sleep.
The identification of potential Zmora typically focused on individuals with specific birth characteristics believed to predispose them to this condition. These varied somewhat by region, but commonly included being born with a caul, amniotic, membrane covering the face, being born with teeth already present, having unusual physical features such as joined eyebrows, extra fingers, or distinctive birthmarks, or being born during specific cosmic alignments or calendar dates associated with supernatural significance. Once suspicion fell on an individual as a potential Zmora, communities typically progressed through a series of escalating responses, beginning with additional protective measures and moving toward more interventionist approaches only if the problem persisted. This measured response reflected the understanding that being a Zmora was an affliction rather than a choice, deserving of compassion alongside practical management. The first level of response typically involved enhanced protective
measures in the households experiencing attacks.
A specialist, usually an elder with particular knowledge of supernatural matters, might be consulted to evaluate existing protections and recommend additions or modifications. These might include more powerful herbs, specially blessed objects, or protective rituals performed at specific lunar phases or calendar points considered particularly effective against the Zmora. A healer's record from 1574 illustrates this initial response. The family of Tomasz sought my help as they believe. A neighbor's daughter is visiting them as a Zmora. I have provided stronger protections, a special bundle of 9 herbs to be placed beneath each bed, new protective marks for their window frames drawn with chalk, blessed at Easter, and holy water from 7 different churches to be sprinkled in a circle around each sleeping place. I have instructed them to maintain a small fire of juniper wood through the night hours for 9 consecutive nights. If enhanced household protections proved insufficient, attention would turn to the suspected Zmora individual directly, with interventions designed to prevent their spirit from wandering during sleep. These measures typically aimed to physically anchor the spirit to the body rather than punish the suspected individual. Common approaches included special binding rituals, where red thread would be tied around the person's limbs before sleep, the placement of specific objects near or beneath their bed, or the recitation of prayers or charms over the sleeping person intended to keep their spirit contained within their body. A village priest's diary from 1581 records such an intervention. At the request of several families, I have blessed red thread with which young Maria's mother will bind her wrists and ankles before sleep to prevent her spirit from wandering as a Zmora. I have also provided a small bag containing blessed salt, church incense, and a paper bearing the prayer to Saint Benedict, which is to be placed beneath her pillow. The girl herself has been most cooperative, being distressed at the thought that she might be harming her neighbors, though she has no memory of doing so. This last point highlights an important aspect of Zmora cases. The suspected individuals often participated willingly in remedial measures, distressed by the possibility that they might be unwittingly harming others during sleep. Unlike witch accusations, which typically met with denial and resistance from the accused, Zmora cases often involved cooperative efforts between the community and the suspected individual to solve what was perceived as a shared problem. If binding measures proved insufficient, more intensive interventions might be attempted. These could include having the suspected Zmora sleep in a specially prepared location away from their normal bed, perhaps in a room with additional religious imagery, in a space where protective rituals had been performed, or even, temporarily, in a church or chapel if the local religious authorities permitted such arrangements. In some cases, night watches might be established, with family members or neighbors taking turns to keep the suspected individual awake at the specific hours when Zmora attacks were reported to occur. A community record from 1569 describes such an arrangement. It has been agreed that young Pavel, suspected of being a Zmora without his knowledge, shall sleep in the small room beside the church for 7 nights. The village council has appointed 3 elders to maintain watch in rotation, ensuring he does not fall into deep sleep during the midnight hour when attacks have been reported. The priest has blessed the chamber and provided holy water and a crucifix to be placed beside the bed. Pavel has agreed to this arrangement, being troubled by the thought that his spirit may be harming his neighbors. In particularly persistent cases, more permanent solutions might be sought. Families might arrange for suspected Zmora individuals to sleep with specific bedmates thought to anchor their spirits. Often an older relative with strong spiritual authority or someone wearing powerful protective objects. Sleeping arrangements within households might be permanently reorganized to place the suspected Zmora in a position where their nocturnal activities could be monitored or contained. In some communities, certain occupational roles were considered appropriate for those suspected of being Zmora, as these positions required night wakefulness, thus preventing the problematic sleep during which spirit wandering occurred. These might include night watchmen, midwives, who were often called during night hours, or shepherds maintaining night watches over flocks. By channeling suspected Zmora individuals into these socially necessary but somewhat marginal roles, communities found ways to accommodate these individuals while managing their perceived supernatural risk. A village record from 1585 notes such an accommodation. Jan, long suspected of being a Zmora, though no fault of his own, has been appointed night watchman for the village. In this role he sleeps during daylight hours when the Zmora spirit cannot wander and remains awake during the dangerous night hours. He has served 3 years in this position with no further reports of Zmora attacks in the village, and receives fair payment for this service, which protects both the community from fire and theft and from his own unwitting night wanderings. The social consequences for those identified as likely Zmora varied significantly depending on community dynamics, the individual's prior social standing, and the severity of the reported attacks. Unlike witch accusations in Western Europe, which frequently led to severe legal consequences, including execution, Zmora cases rarely entered formal legal systems. Instead, they were typically handled through community mechanisms and informal social adjustments. In communities with strong communal bonds and a clear understanding of the Zmora as an affliction rather than a choice, suspected individuals might face limited social consequences beyond the specific interventions designed to manage their condition. They would continue participating in normal community life, with their Zmora nature treated as simply one aspect of their identity requiring specific management, similar to a chronic health condition. A letter from 1572 from a father to his son, studying in a distant city, reveals this matter-of-fact approach. Your sister Maria continues well, though we maintain the protective measures against her Zmora nature as advised by grandmother. She sleeps with the red threads bound properly and the special herbs beneath her pillow, and we have had no incidents this past winter. She has received an offer of marriage from the miller's son, who has been informed of her condition, and accepts, it having had an aunt with the same affliction who lived a good and proper life with similar precaution. In less cohesive communities, particularly during periods of broader social stress, or in regions where Western European witch-hunting ideologies had gained influence, the consequences could be more severe. Suspected Zmora individuals might face increasing social isolation, difficulty finding marriage partners, or economic limitations as others became reluctant to engage in certain types of transactions with them. In extreme cases, they might be pressured to leave the community entirely, especially if attacks continued despite interventions. The gendered dimension of Zmora suspicion differed somewhat from Western European witch accusations. While women were more frequently suspected than men, The disparity was less pronounced than in witch trials, with male Zamora being relatively common in folklore and community records. This more balanced gender distribution likely reflected the understanding of the Zamora condition as an inherent quality present from birth rather than a moral failing or deliberate evil choice. Frameworks that more frequently targeted women. In other supernatural accusations, age distribution also differed from witch accusation patterns. Where Western European witchcraft accusations predominantly targeted older women, Zamora suspicions fell more frequently on younger individuals, often adolescents or young adults. This pattern likely reflected both the association with birth characteristics, which would be known from infancy but become problematic mainly after childhood, and the psychological realities of sleep paralysis, which occurs more frequently during adolescence and early adulthood. The religious authorities' response to Zamora cases varied significantly across Slavic regions and denominations. Catholic authorities in Western Slavic areas, more influenced by Western European theological frameworks, sometimes attempted to reframe Zamora cases within the context of demonic influence or possession, recommending exorcism rituals rather than traditional Zamora management techniques. Orthodox authorities in Eastern regions typically took a more accommodating approach, incorporating traditional protective practices within religious frameworks or offering specialized blessings for both suspected Zamora individuals and those experiencing attacks. A Catholic priest's report from 1579 demonstrates the more interventionist approach. I have instructed the family that what they call Zamora is in truth a demonic affliction, requiring proper spiritual remedies rather than the old superstitions. I have performed the minor exorcism over the girl they suspect and blessed their house according to the proper rite. I have confiscated the pagan charms they had placed about the home, bundles of herbs and threads, and replaced these with proper Christian protections, holy water, blessed candles, and images of the saints. An Orthodox priest's journal from 1583 shows the more integrative approach. For the young man thought to be a Zamora, I have performed the blessing for troubled sleep, using the prayers of Saint John Chrysostom. I have blessed the red thread his mother uses to bind his wrists before sleep and instructed them to maintain an oil lamp before the icon of the Mother of God throughout the night. The traditional herbs they use I have also blessed, seeing no contradiction between these ancient remedies given by God in nature and the prayers of the Church. By the late 16th century, elite medical opinion in some Slavic regions had begun offering naturalistic explanations for both Zamora attacks and the condition of being a Zamora. Physicians trained in Western European medical traditions introduced humoral explanations similar to those applied to the night hag or incubus in other regions, suggesting that certain physical characteristics might create humoral imbalances that manifested in troubled sleep for both the Zamora individual and those around them. A physician's treatise from Prague, dated 1591, presents this perspective. What the common folk call Zamora proceeds from an excess of melancholic humor affecting the brain during sleep. Those born with certain features, a caul covering the face, teeth already emerged, or a predominance of certain planetary influences, may have a natural tendency toward this melancholic excess. Their disturbed sleep creates vapors that may affect others sleeping nearby, causing similar symptoms through natural contagion rather than spiritual wandering, as commonly believed. Such naturalistic explanations gained limited traction among educated elites, but had minimal impact on popular belief through most of the 16th century. For the average Slavic villager, the Zamora remained a terrifying reality, a night entity that attacked during vulnerable sleep states, or, more troublingly, a condition that might affect neighbors, friends, or family members, transforming them into unwitting supernatural threats during sleep. As you contemplate the complex social and psychological dynamics of Zmora beliefs, consider how this framework provided communities with explanatory tools for managing the universal human experience
of sleep paralysis.
Unlike witch-hunting frameworks that externalize threat onto marginalized individuals who could be eliminated through judicial violence, the Zmora belief system generally fostered accommodation and management rather than elimination. It recognized the humanity of the suspected individual while still addressing the genuine terror experienced by those suffering sleep paralysis episodes. The Slavic Zmora represents the final regional variation in our exploration of 16th-century European bedtime beliefs. From the English night hag to the Alpine Alp, from the Mediterranean incubus to the Slavic Zmora, we have traveled across a continent united by common neurological experiences, but divided by distinctive cultural interpretations. These nocturnal entities, though forgotten or dismissed by many modern sleepers, once dominated the nighttime fears of entire populations, shaping everything from bedroom architecture to community relationships. As you drift towards sleep tonight, in your well-lit, scientifically understood modern bedroom, perhaps you'll spare a thought for your 16th century ancestors, for whom the approach of sleep brought not just rest, but vulnerability to a host of terrifying supernatural entities. Though we may no longer fear the night hag or Zmora, perhaps some echo of that ancient nocturnal anxiety remains in our own culture's persistent fascination with things that go bump in the night. Sleep well, and should you experience the pressure
on your chest and the sense of a presence in your room, at least you know its name,